Take a slow breath in and let it drift away. Tonight we travel far back in time, more than 2 millennia, to a world both familiar and strange. A world of desert winds whispering across the Nile, of gold crowns glinting in torchlight, of families bound together not by love, but by the delicate, dangerous threads of power. It is the world into which Cleopatra was born. When we hear her name today, we often imagine something immediate. Sharp black eyeliner, golden ornaments, dramatic entrances by river barge. Yet Cleopatra's story did not begin in glamour. It began in a dynasty already fraying, a lineage stretched across centuries, carrying with it both prestige and decay. The dynasty was the house of the Ptolemies, descendants not of ancient pharaohs, but of Greeks. Their founder, Ptolemy I, had once marched beside Alexander the Great. When Alexander's empire splintered, Ptolemy claimed Egypt as his inheritance. In this act, a new ruling family was born, Greek in speech, Greek in culture, and yet perched upon the throne of the most enduring civilization on earth. For nearly 300 years, the Ptolemies lived between two worlds. Around them stretched temples carved with hieroglyphs older than memory, priests chanting prayers that had been whispered since before pyramids rose. And yet, within their palaces, they spoke Greek, dined on Greek feasts, and clung to Greek customs. Most never even bothered to learn the Egyptian tongue. It was as though they had moved into a house filled with history and spirits, but chose to live only in the front room, ignoring the rest. Still, power has its own momentum. Despite their distance from the people, the Ptolemies ruled. They minted coins with their profiles, built monuments in their names, and played the part of pharaohs, even as they lived in a world apart. And within that long line of rulers, a child was born who would eventually change the rhythm of history itself. Cleopatra. 7. She was not the first Cleopatra. In fact, several women of her line bore that name. But this Cleopatra would outshine them all. Her father was Ptolemy XII, remembered by history not as a strong leader, but as a man mocked for his weaknesses. He loved music more than governance, so much so that he gained a nickname, the flute player. To some, it was a gentle jest. To others, it was a cutting reminder that Egypt's king was more entertainer than ruler. Yet from this unsteady foundation, Cleopatra emerged. The world she entered was complicated, precarious, and full of contradictions. The Nile still flooded each year, bringing life to the soil. Markets in Alexandria bustled with goods from India, Nubia, Greece, and beyond. Scholars studied at the Great Library, where scrolls multiplied like autumn leaves. But politics were treacherous. Within the Ptolemaic household, marriage was not about affection, it was about strategy. To keep power pure, brothers married sisters, nieces wed uncles, and cousins intertwined in endless loops. In this dynasty, love was secondary, bloodlines were paramount. Cleopatra herself was drawn into this pattern. As a teenager, she was wed to her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. It is difficult to imagine such an arrangement. She, a young woman with a sharp mind and strong will, tethered to a boy scarcely into adolescence. Their marriage was not a partnership in the modern sense. It was a political contrivance, a way to bind titles, to create the appearance of unity. But appearances rarely hold for long. As co-rulers, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII were depicted side by side. Their names appeared together on decrees. Yet behind the inscriptions, behind the carefully struck coins, lay tension. Cleopatra was ambitious, bold, willing to take initiative. The young kings, regents, and advisors feared her independence. They did not want a queen who acted as though she alone could rule. And so, whispers turned to schemes to action. Before long, Cleopatra found herself pushed aside, stripped of her position, and cast into exile. Imagine for a moment the strangeness of it. One day, Queen of Egypt, mistress of Alexandria's palaces. The next, a wanderer without power, her survival uncertain. Exile can break a spirit. It can teach bitterness or despair. But Cleopatra's story does not end in silence. She did not fade into the background of history. Instead, she began to plan. And here, history gifts us one of its most vivid tales, the return of Cleopatra to Alexandria, hidden inside a rolled carpet. It is a story often told with drama, but tonight, let us imagine it more quietly. Picture the wide halls of an Alexandrian palace. Outside, the streets are alive with voices in many languages: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic. Merchants sell spices, papyrus, silk. Sailors call out as they load ships. Yet inside, the palace is hushed, the air heavy with the scent of burning oil lamps. In one chamber waits Julius Caesar, the Roman general, whose presence in Egypt is both opportunity and danger. He is weary from campaigns, his mind full of matters of empire, and into this setting comes a bundle large, rolled, unassuming, carried as though it were nothing more than a delivery. Then, as servants unroll the cloth, a figure emerges. Cleopatra herself, stepping forth not in fanfare, but in silence. She does not need trumpets. She does not need dancers or drums. Her entrance is enough. For Caesar, it is a moment unexpected. For Cleopatra, it is a return, carefully staged, a gesture that says more than words could. She has not begged. She has not pleaded. She has arrived, present and undeniable, reclaiming her place with courage and wit. In that moment, something changes. Cleopatra is no longer the exiled sister, nor the forgotten queen. She is once again a force in Egypt, and now she stands before the most powerful man in Rome. It is here, in this quiet but remarkable entrance, that Cleopatra's path begins to entwine with the fate of empires. Cleopatra's re-entry into Alexandria through the rolled carpet is often retold as if it were a theatrical flourish, a stunt of charm and spectacle. But if we slow the story down, we can sense something different. It was not simply a trick to impress Julius Caesar. It was a careful calculation, a risk that placed her life entirely in the balance. For if she had been discovered too soon, if the plan had failed, she might never have walked out of exile alive. To understand why she chose such a daring method, we must return to the fragile political stage she faced. Cleopatra's younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, had been left in the hands of regents and advisors who saw themselves as guardians of the boy king and of their own power. For them, Cleopatra's independence was a threat. She spoke to envoys without permission. She made decisions without waiting for approval. She carried herself like a monarch in her own right, not a co-ruler bound to a child. When she was cast out, she might have been expected to vanish quietly. Many royal women throughout history have been discarded, replaced, their stories dissolving into silence. But Cleopatra had no intention of fading. In exile, she sought allies, gathered support, and bided her time. Every day was a calculation of patience, and when the moment came, when Caesar himself was present in Alexandria, she seized it. Imagine the night before her return. Perhaps she sat with only a few trusted attendants, speaking in low voices. The plan was simple in outline, yet perilous in execution. Conceal herself within a carpet, have it delivered into Caesar's chamber, and rely on the element of surprise to carry her safely into his presence. One can almost hear the hush of that night, the steady beating of her heart as she prepared to entrust her life to woven cloth and fortune. When at last the carpet was unrolled, Cleopatra's gamble succeeded. Caesar, seasoned by decades of warfare, understood immediately the significance of what stood before him. This was no ordinary queen, no timid petitioner. This was a woman bold enough to place herself directly in his path, a woman who understood both theatre and strategy. In that moment, she secured not merely his attention, but his respect. From there, the course of events shifted. Cleopatra and Caesar formed an alliance part political necessity, part personal connection, and, in time, perhaps more. Yet before their relationship could take root, there was war to contend with. The civil conflict between Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy XIII, erupted into open struggle. Streets that once echoed with trade and chatter now rang with the clash of soldiers. Fires rose, and the great city trembled. For those who lived within Alexandria, it must have been bewildering to wake one morning beneath the rule of one monarch, only to find the tide of power shifting by evening. Cleopatra stood firm, her claim reinforced by Caesar's presence. And in the violence that followed, her brother's fate was sealed. Accounts tell us he drowned in the Nile, caught in the chaos of retreat. His life ended not with ceremony, but with the dark current pulling him under. The river, eternal and indifferent, carried him away, and Cleopatra remained. With her rival brother gone, Cleopatra was restored to the throne. But once again, the traditions of her dynasty required her to marry another sibling, Ptolemy XIV. Younger, still. For the public eye, they appeared as co-rulers. In truth, Cleopatra's authority was unchallenged. The boy was little more than a name upon decrees, while she steered the kingdom with deliberate hands. And yet, in those days, her power was not secured by Egypt alone. The shadow of Rome loomed over every decision. Rome hungered for grain, for riches, for dominance. Egypt, with its fertile fields and strategic harbours, was a jewel too tempting to ignore. Cleopatra knew this. To survive as queen, she needed Rome not as an enemy, but as a partner, or at least a wary ally. Here lay the significance of her bond with Caesar. It was not only companionship, it was diplomacy, it was survival, and Cleopatra excelled at survival. What set her apart from her Ptolemaic ancestors was her ability to bridge worlds. While many before her had clung to Greek customs, aloof from the land they ruled, Cleopatra embraced Egypt itself. She learned the Egyptian tongue, the first of her dynasty to do so. She walked among her people. She presented herself not only as a queen, but as the living embodiment of Isis, the great goddess of motherhood and magic. Imagine the effect this had upon her subjects. For centuries, they had watched foreign rulers sit upon their throne, speaking a foreign language, detached from their daily lives. But here was a queen who addressed them directly, who honored their gods, who carried herself as one of them. It must have felt as though Egypt, long ruled by outsiders, at last had a monarch who truly belonged, and yet she did not abandon her Greek heritage. To the scholars, the merchants, the Greek-speaking elite of Alexandria, she was still familiar, still one of their own. To the Romans, she was dazzling, capable of conversing fluently in their tongue, debating their envoys, sparring with their politicians. In all, she is said to have spoken 9 languages, 9 doors through which she could enter the hearts of nations. This ability was more than impressive. It was disarming. To speak to someone, in their own words, in their own rhythms, is to shorten the distance between strangers. Cleopatra wielded language as both a bridge and a blade. To the Egyptians, she was a daughter of the Nile. To the Greeks, a queen of their lineage. To the Romans, a woman who could match their wit word for word. It was this versatility, this ability to be many things to many people, that allowed her to endure where others might have fallen. She was not one mask, but many, worn with care, each fitted to the moment. So the young queen, once exiled, now sat again upon her throne, stronger than before. Her brother husband, Ptolemy XIV, faded into the background. Her alliance with Caesar secured her position. Egypt, for the time being, was stable. And yet, history does not allow stillness for long. Storms always gathered, whether in the desert winds or in the Senate halls of Rome. For now, though, Cleopatra could breathe. She had reclaimed what was hers, and she had done so not through brute force, but through boldness, cunning, and the quiet strength of patience. It is in this calm after turmoil that we can pause with her. Picture her, perhaps in a palace chamber, standing at a window overlooking the waters of the Nile. The torches flicker against stone walls. The night air is heavy with the scent of lotus and river. And she, a queen restored, allows herself a moment to rest, to prepare for the chapters yet to come. The return of Cleopatra to her throne did not mark the end of her trials, but rather the beginning of her true reign. With her younger brother nominally by her side as co-ruler, the outward image of tradition was maintained. But in truth, Cleopatra was now the steady hand guiding Egypt. Still, a queen could not rely on appearances alone. She needed symbols, she needed presence. She needed to make the people believe, not simply that she held power, but that she embodied it. And so Cleopatra began to craft her image with deliberate care. Unlike her ancestors, who had ruled as foreigners aloof from the land, she stepped fully into the role of pharaoh. She spoke Egyptian, the language of her people. She embraced their rituals, prayed in their temples, and wove herself into their myths. Most strikingly, she took upon herself the mantle of Isis, the goddess of life and magic. Coins were struck bearing her image adorned with divine symbols. Temples proclaimed her as the living goddess returned to earth. For her subjects, this was no longer a distant monarch speaking in foreign tongues. This was a ruler who seemed to breathe the same air, drink from the same river, and worship the same gods. One can picture the effect. An Egyptian farmer, weary after long days in the fields, hearing news of a queen who prayed to Isis, who honored the ancient traditions, who addressed her people in their own tongue. For the first time in centuries, perhaps, the pharaoh on the throne felt less like an intruder and more like kin. But Cleopatra's brilliance was that she never abandoned her other faces. She remained Greek enough to reassure the scholars, the administrators, the merchant class in Alexandria who saw themselves as heirs of Hellenistic culture. And she was eloquent in Latin and other languages, able to meet Roman envoys on equal terms, unbending, unflustered, speaking with a fluency that left them unsettled. In this way, she was not one ruler, but many. To the Egyptians, she was a daughter of the Nile. To the Greeks, she was a queen of their blood. To the Romans, she was a voice impossible to ignore. Few monarchs in any age have balanced so many roles at once, wearing each with grace. Of course, behind the divine imagery and the careful diplomacy, Cleopatra was still a human being, one who lived through turbulent times. And with Julius Caesar by her side, her life became entwined not only with Egypt's destiny, but with the greater tide of Roman politics. Caesar did not remain in Egypt forever. His wars and responsibilities called him back to Rome. But during his stay, he and Cleopatra shared more than strategy. They became companions. And from that companionship came a child, a son, named Ptolemy XV, though more often called Caesarion, the Little Caesar. For Cleopatra, this child was more than a symbol of personal affection. He was her statement to the world. Egypt and Rome could be bound not only by treaties, but by blood. To her people, Caesarion represented continuity, the next generation of a divine lineage. To the Romans, however, his existence was a provocation. a reminder that Caesar had ties beyond their city's control. But those storms lay ahead. For now, Cleopatra's focus was Egypt itself. She worked to steady her kingdom, to strengthen its economy, to secure its borders. She made herself visible, present, a queen not hidden behind palace walls, but one who travelled, who appeared, who made her presence felt. Let us pause here and imagine a scene from those years. Picture Cleopatra sailing upon the Nile. Her barge, not the extravagant spectacle it would later become with Mark Antony, but still adorned in elegance. The river glitters beneath the sun, reeds sway along the banks, and fishermen pause to watch the passing of their queen. She sits beneath a canopy, perhaps reading, perhaps speaking softly with attendants, perhaps gazing out across the endless horizon of her land. In moments like these, one can sense her duality, both a woman of flesh and thought, and a monarch draped in divinity. The hum of insects, the cry of birds, the steady rhythm of oars, all of it forms a backdrop to a reign that was only just beginning. In the stillness of such images, we glimpse the calm that balanced the storms. Cleopatra, young yet resolute, had weathered exile, reclaimed her crown, and begun to shape herself into something larger than life. The carpet had been only the beginning. Now she stood as queen in her own right, her son at her side, and the vast stage of history opening before her. The years ahead would bring triumphs, alliances, betrayals, and tragedies. They would carry her to the heights of grandeur and to the edge of despair. But here, in these first chapters, we see the essence of who she was: bold, intelligent, unyielding, and endlessly adaptive. It is from this foundation that the later stories of Caesar, of Antony, of the final days of the Ptolemaic line would rise. Cleopatra had entered history not as a passive figure carried by events, but as a voice, a presence, a queen who claimed her place and held it. And so part one of her story closes here, with Cleopatra restored, with Egypt watching her, and with Rome beginning to realize that this woman, this queen, would not be forgotten. When the dust of battle and the smoke of Alexandria's fires finally cleared, Cleopatra could breathe more freely. She had endured exile, intrigue, siege, and bloodshed, but now her throne was secure, and beside her stood Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome. Their partnership soon took to the water. The Nile, eternal, winding, mysterious, became the stage for one of the most celebrated journeys of antiquity. Cleopatra wished to remind her people of Egypt's resilience and her own divine right to rule, and Caesar wished to see with his own eyes the river that fed one of the world's oldest civilizations. And so they embarked together, not as fugitives or soldiers, but as sovereigns. Picture the royal barge gliding down the wide green waters of the Nile. Its sails caught the southern breeze, painted in rich hues, embroidered with gold thread that glittered under the sunday. Musicians played soft flutes, their notes mingling with the cries of ibis and the rustling reeds. Courtiers lounged at the deck's edge, their chatter hushed in the presence of the queen and her Roman guest. Cleopatra appeared on that vessel not merely as a queen, but as Isis incarnate. Draped in linen fine as breath, crowned with a diadem of gold, her movements were measured, graceful, deliberate. Beside her, Caesar, older, war-hardened, yet clearly enthralled, witnessed a spectacle of Egypt's wealth and spiritual might. Each stop along the river was both political theatre and sacred ritual. In temples at Dendera and Edfu, Cleopatra stood before statues of ancient gods, incense curling upward like threads tying heaven to earth. Priests bowed low as she offered sacrifices, her gestures echoing rituals performed by generations of pharaohs before her. The people gathered at riverbanks caught glimpses of her, and in those moments awe mingled with relief. Egypt was not leaderless, not fractured. She was there. She endured. For Caesar, accustomed to Rome's marble forums and republican debates, The grandeur of Egypt was unlike anything he had known. Here was a civilization with roots far deeper than Rome's, with rituals as old as the pyramids themselves. He understood, perhaps more clearly than any Roman before him, the gravity of aligning himself with this land and with the queen who embodied it. But beyond politics, there was intimacy. The voyage down the Nile was long, and in its length there was space for companionship. Away from the fires of Alexandria, away from the clamours of war, Cleopatra and Caesar shared quiet hours, watching fishermen cast their nets in silver arcs, listening to the Nile lap gently against the hull, tracing constellations reflected in dark water under a desert sky. It is easy, centuries later, to let myth blur with fact. Yet what remains clear is this: the queen and the general found not only common strategy, but common presence. Cleopatra, still in her 20s, possessed wit, humour, and daring that enlivened the Roman commander, who was nearing 50. Their connection, whether viewed as romantic, pragmatic, or both, was undeniable. From this bond came a child, Ptolemy Caesar, called Caesarion, Little Caesar. His birth was not only personal, but political. For Cleopatra, he was proof of her closeness with Rome's most powerful man. For Caesar, though he never formally named him heir, the boy stood as a living symbol of their union, a reminder that empires could blend as bloodlines did. As news of the voyage spread, so too did Cleopatra's image. She was no longer simply the sister queen restored to her throne. She was the Nile's living goddess, the woman who had captured Caesar's favour, the sovereign whose reign carried both ancient legitimacy and Roman recognition. The journey also gave Cleopatra time to envision Egypt's renewal. She understood that spectacle and stability must go hand in hand. The people needed reassurance not only in their queen's divine right, but in her ability to maintain abundance, grain shipments, temple rites, law, and order. Sailing past fields of barley, date palms heavy with fruit, and villages huddled along the water's edge, she saw both her kingdom's fragility and its endurance. And so she planned. She envisioned irrigation restored, temples patronized, scholars supported. She envisioned Egypt not as a relic under Rome's shadow, but as a land alive, radiant, self-possessed. For Caesar, the voyage was no less meaningful. It was a pause, perhaps the only true pause, in a life otherwise consumed by war and politics. He had seen Gaul's forests, Britain's cliffs, Rome's Senate in turmoil, but here he saw something different. The timeless rhythm of the Nile, a civilization that endured not by conquest, but by cycles of flood and harvest. Perhaps it softened him, if only briefly. Perhaps it reminded him that empire was not only taken, but tended. The image of Caesar and Cleopatra sailing the Nile has endured through history because it captures a rare convergence. Power, beauty, tradition, and intimacy flowing together like the river itself. It was not merely a royal excursion. It was a performance of sovereignty, a weaving together of identities Roman and Egyptian, mortal and divine, pragmatic and mythic. When the voyage ended, and their barge moored once more, Cleopatra had achieved more than any decree could have. She had shown Caesar, and through him, Rome, that Egypt was not a mere province to be, but a kingdom worthy of respect, alliance, and awe. And though Rome would not always remember her with kindness, though Roman poets would later reduce her to caricature, for that moment in history, Cleopatra was resplendent, commanding, unshakably central. The Nile voyage left echoes that lingered long after its sails were lowered. Among the most enduring was the child born of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. In the quiet chambers of Alexandria's palace, surrounded by scented oils and soft lamplight, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, though to many he was known simply as Caesarion, Little Caesar. It is worth pausing here. Imagine the weight bound up in that tiny child. He was not just Cleopatra's son nor merely Caesar's. He embodied two civilizations, two traditions, two visions of power. In his infant form lay the hope of uniting the deep-rooted line of Egyptian pharaohs with the expanding dominion of Rome. Cleopatra, always deliberate, understood this better than anyone. To her subjects, Caesarion was proof that Egypt's queen had Rome's favor. To Rome, he was evidence of a bond that went beyond diplomacy, beyond war. He was both a child and a declaration. Life in Alexandria during this time carried a sense of fragile balance. The people, though still reeling from years of turmoil, began to settle into the rhythm of restored order. Grain flowed through storehouses once more, temples resumed their sacred cycles, and the Nile's waters continued their eternal rising and falling. Cleopatra, appearing often with her child in her arms or at her side, projected not only sovereignty, but continuity. Egypt's present and future were there, visible in mother and son. Within palace walls, Caesarion's upbringing blended traditions. Egyptian nurses whispered lullabies drawn from ancient hymns, their melodies older than the pyramids themselves. Roman tutors, at Caesar's urging, introduced Latin words and Roman customs. In his cradle lay amulets of Isis, yet beside them stood small carvings of Roman eagles. Cleopatra's vision was clear. Caesarion would embody both worlds, trained to move easily between them. For Julius Caesar, the matter of Caesarion was more complex. In Alexandria, he acknowledged the boy, spending time with Cleopatra and their son. But in Rome, where politics was a realm of rivalries and jealousies, he never formally declared Caesarion his heir. Rome already had an heir apparent in his grandnephew Octavian. To add another contender would have been to court chaos. And yet, the very existence of Caesarion unsettled Rome. Whispers spread in the Senate. What would happen if Caesar tried to make a queen of Egypt his consort, and an Egyptian prince his heir? The tension between admiration and suspicion marked Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra when they later journeyed together to Rome. It was an unprecedented sight. The Queen of Egypt walking Rome's streets, her son in tow, her presence sparking awe in some, outrage in others. For Romans, Cleopatra seemed almost too vivid, too unlike their own matrons. Draped in silks dyed with Tyrian purple, adorned with jewels drawn from Nile mines, she carried herself not as a guest but as an equal sovereign. At banquets she spoke with wit and ease, conversing in several tongues, her laughter ringing clear above the chatter of senators. Some were charmed, others were unnerved. In those months, Cleopatra and Caesarion lived in one of Caesar's villas across the Tiber, a residence that became a magnet for gossip. For Romans used to wives who stayed in the background, Cleopatra's presence commanding, visible, unapologetic, was both fascinating and scandalous. But for Cleopatra, Rome was not a stage to conquer with seduction or spectacle. It was a stage to assert legitimacy. She wanted the Roman elite to see her not as a foreign interloper, but as a monarch with the favor of their most powerful man. She wanted Caesarion to be recognized not as a curiosity, but as Caesar's living legacy. The child, of course, was too young to know the weight of these expectations. He played in courtyards, toddled along mosaic floors, reached for his mother's bracelets. Yet each smile, each gesture, became fuel for speculation. Senators argued quietly, if Caesar loved this boy, what would become of Rome's future? If Cleopatra remained in Caesar's orbit, would Egypt's queen one day influence the destiny of the Republic itself? The whispers grew sharper, and in the brittle politics of Rome, whispers could be as dangerous as daggers. For Cleopatra, the trip to Rome confirmed something she had long known. Her future, and Egypt's, would always be tied to Rome's shifting fortunes. She could not disentangle herself, nor did she wish to. The survival of her dynasty depended on her ability to walk this narrow line adored by some Romans, despised by others, but never forgotten. Back in Alexandria, after Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra's return was marked by grief and caution. Caesarion, no longer just a child, became a symbol, contested by factions. To some Egyptians, he was the bridge to Roman might. To others, he was a fragile target, vulnerable to the ambitions of Rome's next leaders. For Cleopatra, the lesson was sharp. She had seen how swiftly Rome could turn, how quickly fortunes could collapse under the knife of betrayal. She knew, now more than ever, that Egypt's future rested in both resilience and adaptation. Caesarion would need to be raised not only as her son, but as a survivor. And so, palace life resumed, but with heavier shadows. Tutors drilled Caesarion in philosophy, mathematics, rhetoric. Guards doubled their vigilance around his chambers. Cleopatra spent hours with priests, seeking omens, watching the stars, ensuring that Isis herself guarded the boy. Caesarion grew, not yet aware of how heavily the world leaned upon him. Cleopatra, meanwhile, prepared herself for the trials ahead, for she understood that Rome's gaze had not left her, nor her son, even as the Tiber's waters flowed far from the Nile. When news reached Alexandria that Julius Caesar had been struck down beneath the portico of Pompey's theatre, the world seemed to tilt. Cleopatra, who had woven so much of her future into Caesar's presence, understood at once that the foundations beneath her had shifted. Rome was entering another cycle of blood, betrayal, and ambition. And she, though distant, was not free from its pull. The reports came in fragments, a dagger here, a senator there, the echo of "Et tu, Brute?" whispered through Roman streets. Cleopatra listened with quiet intensity as messengers relayed the story of March's Ides. Caesar, surrounded by men he once called allies, the blades rising and falling, the body left crumpled at the feet of Pompey's statue. For Rome, it was a moment of rupture. For Cleopatra, it was a summons to caution. Her first thoughts went to her son. Caesarion was still a child, yet already he was entangled in Rome's struggles. Cleopatra knew that his very existence made him both a beacon of legitimacy and a target for vengeance. Without Caesar's hand to shield them, the queen and her son stood exposed to the ambitions of men who might prefer the boy extinguished rather than acknowledged. And so, within the palace walls of Alexandria, life grew more guarded. Guards stood longer watches. Messages from Rome were opened and read with wary eyes. Cleopatra herself took on an air of measured calm. Not panic, never panic, but a silence that signaled how carefully she weighed each move. Rome, after all, was not simply mourning, it was dividing. The Senate's daggers had removed Caesar, but not the empire he had reshaped. Into the vacuum stepped two figures who would shape Cleopatra's destiny as surely as Caesar once had. Octavian, the adopted heir, and Mark Antony, the general who had been Caesar's trusted companion. Between them, power cracked and shifted like plates beneath the earth. In Alexandria, Cleopatra watched from afar, waiting to see which way the balance might lean. She had learned from Caesar that proximity to Rome's leaders brought both peril and opportunity. She would not rush. Instead, she fortified Egypt, strengthening her hold on the Nile's resources, securing loyalty among the priests, and ensuring that grain continued to flow toward Rome, a reminder of Egypt's importance. Within her court, Cleopatra leaned ever more heavily on ceremony and symbolism. Appearing as Isis incarnate, she offered her people an image of stability, of continuity amid chaos. She carried Caesarion in public, a living reminder of the line she claimed bound Egypt to Rome's greatest leader. The message was subtle but deliberate. Egypt was no pawn. It was a partner if Rome chose to recognize it. But beneath the ritual calm, Cleopatra must have felt the strain. She had loved Caesar in her own way, though love for a queen was never free of calculation. His death left not only a personal emptiness, but also a political fracture. In the still hours of the night, perhaps as she walked the palace gardens by torchlight, she must have considered the fragility of her position. If Caesar could fall to knives among men he trusted, what shield had she? And yet, Cleopatra was not one to retreat into mourning. She allowed herself the rituals of grief, but not the paralysis of despair. Instead, she turned her gaze forward, to the men who now contested Caesar's mantle. She studied reports of Octavian's movements, of Antony's speeches, of the shifting allegiances in the Senate and among Rome's legions. Slowly, a plan began to form. Antony, she knew, had been close to Caesar. His soldiers loved him. His voice carried weight, and though some dismissed him as reckless, Cleopatra saw in him a man of action, a man who might yet be drawn into alliance. Octavian, in contrast, was young, untested, and perhaps more dangerous for his very sharpness of mind. To Cleopatra, both men were potential threats, but also potential lifelines. In the years that followed Caesar's death, Cleopatra played a careful game. She offered support when prudent, withheld it when risk outweighed reward. She ensured that Egypt's wealth remained visible, that Rome never forgot the grain ships upon which its citizens depended. She presented herself not as a widow cast adrift, but as a sovereign whose throne rested on ancient stone, whose dynasty reached back to Alexander and beyond. At the same time, she nurtured Caesarion. Tutors taught him not only language and mathematics, but also diplomacy, the art of listening, the practice of restraint. Cleopatra knew that if her son survived, if he one day stood as Egypt's ruler, he would inherit not only a crown, but also a world where survival required the keenest of balances. Years slipped by like the steady flow of the Nile. In Rome, the tides of power rose and fell. Alliances formed, wars ignited, victories celebrated, betrayals plotted. In Alexandria, Cleopatra remained steady, her court a place of ritual beauty and cautious strategy. She received embassies, offered gifts, and spoke with the polished patience of a woman who knew her every word would ripple far beyond her palace walls. Through it all, Caesar's memory lingered. His statue still stood in the palace garden, bronze catching the Egyptian Sunday. His name still whispered in the prayers Cleopatra offered to Isis. For though Caesar was gone, the bond they had forged lived on in their son. And then, at last, the currents of history carried her toward the man who would shape the next chapter of her life, Mark Antony. The meeting would not come abruptly, but slowly, through letters, through envoys, through the invisible threads that pull two figures together across time and distance. Cleopatra, attuned to these threads, prepared herself. She knew Antony was no Caesar, but she also knew that Rome was never ruled by one man for long. If Egypt was to endure, she must step once more into the dangerous dance between throne and empire. So she waited, poised as ever, her sails ready to unfurl when the winds shifted. The years after Caesar's death brought Rome into turbulence once again. From the marble steps of the Senate to the distant camps of legions scattered across the provinces, men debated, schemed, and fought to decide who would inherit the vast power Caesar had gathered. Cleopatra, though watching from Egypt, was never truly separate from these tides. She listened closely, her courtiers recording each shift of Rome's alliances, her messengers riding swift along desert roads with news of battles and treaties. Among all the names that rose in those reports, one began to take on special weight. Mark Antony. He was no stranger to Cleopatra, for he had once visited Egypt as a young officer, years before her great encounter with Caesar. Stories painted him as larger than life, a man of soldier's vigor, given to feasts and laughter, yet also capable of fierce loyalty and cunning strategy. Where Octavian was sharp, cautious, and deliberate, Antony was bold, impulsive, and charismatic. To Cleopatra's ear, this combination carried both danger and promise. It was not long before Antony, in need of allies, sent word to Egypt. His letters were formal at first, reminding Cleopatra of the ties that bound her to Caesar, and, through Caesar, to Antony himself. They spoke of Rome's needs: ships, grain, wealth. But beneath the ink, Cleopatra could almost sense the man himself, impatient, forceful, a soldier unaccustomed to waiting. Cleopatra chose her response with care. She delayed, not out of insult, but of calculation. To answer too quickly would seem desperate. To appear hesitant would diminish Egypt's strength. Instead, she allowed silence to stretch just long enough to suggest that Egypt was not at Rome's command, but Rome's equal. And then, when the moment was right, she agreed to meet Antony in person. And it was a decision that would echo through history. The place chosen was Tarsus, a city set where the Cydnus River winds its way between green banks and rising hills. Antony waited there, surrounded by his soldiers and advisors, no doubt expecting Cleopatra to arrive as a supplicant queen. But Cleopatra, with her deep sense of theatre, planned something altogether different. She sailed up the Cydnus, not as a petitioner, but as a goddess. Her barge was gilded, its sails of purple silk billowing against the sun, oars dipped in rhythm by rowers dressed in silver and gold. Perfume floated across the river, carrying with it the scent of roses and incense. Musicians played soft melodies, and attendants, dressed as nymphs and cupids, moved about the deck. At the center sat Cleopatra herself, adorned as Aphrodite, or as the Egyptians might have seen, Isis radiant and calm. The people of Tarsus crowded the banks, marveling at the vision. Even Antony, whose life had been spent in camps and campaigns, could not help but be caught in the spell. He had expected diplomacy. What he received was pageantry, a spectacle designed not merely to impress, but to remind him that Cleopatra was no ordinary ruler. She was the living embodiment of Egypt's ancient majesty, a queen who understood that power could be displayed not only through armies but through awe. When Cleopatra stepped ashore, the meeting unfolded not as a Roman command to a vassal, but as a negotiation between equals. Antony invited her to dine with him. Cleopatra, with quiet confidence, invited him instead to dine aboard her barge. There, surrounded by torches, music, and the gentle rocking of the river, they spoke. Antony, known for his hearty appetite and love of revelry, found in Cleopatra a match witty, intelligent, unafraid to meet his gaze or counter his words with her own. The bond between them did not form in a single night, but the seed was planted. Antony saw not only a queen, but a woman who could share his love of grandeur and excess, who could meet him in laughter and in strategy alike. Cleopatra, in turn, recognized a man whose ambitions could shield Egypt as Caesar once had, but whose nature was different, more passionate, less restrained, and perhaps, in his own way, more vulnerable to her influence. Their conversations stretched into the nights. They spoke of Rome's future, of Egypt's role, of Caesarion's place in the world. Antony listened as Cleopatra reminded him of Egypt's wealth, its grain, its ships, its position at the crossroads of trade between East and West. She painted Egypt, not as a pawn, but as a prize worth cherishing, an ally worth defending. And slowly, as the days passed, Antony began to see Cleopatra, not merely as Caesar's widow or Egypt's ruler, but as a partner in a grander vision. He, the soldier, and she, the queen. Together they might command not only Rome's legions, but the very currents of history. When at last Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, Antony soon followed. There, In her palace of marble and mosaics, their connection deepened. Feasts were held, dazzling in their excess. Banquets where golden goblets brimmed with wine, halls perfumed with frankincense, and dishes served on platters of silver. Antony, who delighted in display, found in Cleopatra's court a stage upon which his love of magnificence could flourish. Together, they crafted a life of both indulgence and strategy, a union of pleasure and politics. For the people of Alexandria, this partnership brought both wonder and unease. To see their queen entwined with yet another Roman was to be reminded of Egypt's precarious place between independence and empire. Yet Cleopatra, as ever, walked the line carefully. She presented Antony not as a conqueror, but as a guest, a companion, even a co-ruler in festivities. In private, their bond grew more complex. Cleopatra, who had once balanced love with calculation in her bond with Caesar, now found herself in a relationship where calculation mingled with a more immediate warmth. Antony's personality was larger than life, his moods swift, and his affections direct. Cleopatra, attuned to subtler rhythms, matched him with patience and foresight. In this dance, both gave and both gained, but beneath the laughter of feasts and the whispers of lovers, the shadow of Rome never disappeared. Octavian watched from afar, wary of Antony's growing entanglement with the Egyptian queen. The Senate murmured, some with admiration, many with suspicion, and Cleopatra herself, though reveling in Antony's presence, never forgot that alliances with Rome's men were fragile, shifting things. Still, for the moment, Alexandria basked in the glow of their union. The city became a stage for their shared splendor. Cleopatra walked beside Antony in ceremonies, her hand steady on Caesarion's shoulder, reminding the world that Egypt's dynasty continued. Antony, in turn, embraced the Egyptian style of life, finding in the queen's company not only luxury but also a sense of destiny. And so, as the Mediterranean world reeled from Rome's civil wars, Alexandria thrived in its own golden chapter, a chapter lit by torches on the Nile, the laughter of lovers, and the quiet calculations of a queen who knew that history's currents were still far from settled. Alexandria, in those years, became something of a dream world. For the people who lived in its streets, it was as if the city were placed at the center of a theater, where both history and myth mingled. To walk the broad avenues, paved with stone and lined with statues, was to feel both the weight of Egypt's past and the quickening pulse of new possibilities. And at the heart of it all was Cleopatra, no longer alone in her rule, but standing side by side with Mark Antony. The palace by the sea was alive with new rhythms. Antony, who had spent most of his life in the camps of legions, now discovered the delights of a city that celebrated beauty and abundance. He threw himself into the life Cleopatra offered, feasts that stretched until dawn, hunts along the Nile, and endless hours of conversation in perfumed chambers. Cleopatra, in turn, delighted in Antony's presence, for he gave energy to the grandeur she cultivated. Where Caesar had been reserved and cautious, Antony was exuberant, willing to match her sense of spectacle with a childlike joy that made the moments shine brighter. One of the most famous expressions of their companionship was what Alexandrian poets would later call the inimitable livers. It was less an organization than a circle of indulgence. Cleopatra and Antony gathering with friends, philosophers, musicians, and courtiers to feast and drink, to test one another with riddles and jokes, and to celebrate life without concern for tomorrow. They dined on roasted birds, stuffed with herbs, fish pulled fresh from the Mediterranean, and fruits preserved in honey. The air would fill with laughter and song, with the steady pulse of drums and the high, clear voices of flutes. The evenings were not merely about pleasure. Within them, Cleopatra and Antony tested one another's wit and vision. Antony would speak of his battles, of his rival Octavian's slow but steady rise, and of Rome's restless Senate. Cleopatra would listen, offering insights wrapped in stories of Egypt's long dynasties, reminding Antony that power was not only about soldiers but about endurance, the ability to shape memory, to weave symbols, to make a people believe. For Cleopatra, each feast, each shared game, was a chance to bind Antony closer. She knew that Rome's men could be swayed by pleasure as well as reason, by the sense that life beside her was richer, more vivid than life elsewhere. Antony, too, understood the exchange. He found not only joy in Cleopatra's company but also an anchor. Amid the storms of Roman politics, her presence was a haven, reminding him that beyond war there could be calm, beyond ambition there could be delight. Their intimacy deepened with rituals both playful and profound. Stories were told of a wager they made, testing who could spend more extravagantly at a banquet. Cleopatra, with her usual wit, ended the game by dissolving a priceless pearl in vinegar and drinking it, a gesture so extravagant that it silenced even Antony's appetite for competition. Whether or not every detail of the tale is true hardly matters. What mattered was the impression that together they embodied a kind of abundance that seemed almost divine. Yet beneath this glittering surface, politics pressed in. Octavian, watching from Rome, understood that Antony's bond with Cleopatra could shift the balance of power. Antony was no longer merely a Roman general. He was a man enthralled by a queen, whose resources could sustain him in ways Rome alone could not. Grain shipments from Egypt fed legions, gold from Alexandria paid for campaigns, and the image of Antony beside Cleopatra stirred unease among Romans, who feared that their general was becoming too entangled with the East. Cleopatra, however, thought not of Octavian's whispers, but of her own kingdom's security. Egypt, though wealthy, was fragile in its independence. Rome's shadow stretched long, and without Antony's favour, she might soon find herself pressed beneath it. Thus, her devotion to Antony was not only personal, but also practical, a weaving of affection and necessity. She gave him her loyalty, her resources, and the weight of Egypt's heritage. In return, he gave her recognition, protection, and the promise of partnership. In Alexandria, Antony allowed himself to step into Egyptian traditions. He was seen dressed not only as a Roman commander, but in garments styled after pharaohs of old. He joined Cleopatra in ceremonies that honored the gods, walking beside her as though he too shared in the divine aura of rulership. To some, this was mere play. To others, it was a dangerous merging of identities, a Roman losing himself in Egypt's spell. But to Cleopatra, it was a sign that her influence reached deeper than words or treaties. She was not merely hosting a Roman ally. She was shaping him into something more, something that belonged to Egypt as well. The city itself mirrored this blending. The Library of Alexandria, with its scrolls of philosophy and science, welcomed Roman scholars who came in Antony's company. Egyptian festivals grew more elaborate with Roman touches. The people spoke of their queen and the Roman general not as separate figures but as a pair, a partnership that gave Alexandria a new vibrancy. At night, as the lamps flickered in the palace and the noise of feasts softened into silence, Cleopatra and Antony would walk the gardens. The air was heavy with the scent of lotus blossoms, the fountains murmured softly, and the stars spread themselves like jewels across the desert sky. In those hours, their talk often grew quieter. Antony would confess his weariness with Roman politics, the endless rivalries and betrayals. Cleopatra would speak of her hopes for Caesarion, her son, and for Egypt's stability. Together they imagined futures that seemed almost possible. A Mediterranean world where Egypt and Rome ruled in harmony, bound not by conquest, but by love. It was, of course, an illusion. History would not grant them such peace. But in those moments, as their footsteps pressed lightly upon the garden paths, the illusion was enough. They could believe, if only for an hour, that the world might bend to their desires. And so the days in Alexandria stretched on, gilded and fragrant, a mixture of indulgence and intent. Antony became more deeply enmeshed in Cleopatra's life, and Cleopatra, for her part, discovered in Antony a companion unlike any she had known. Their partnership was not without tension, but it was vivid, alive, and for a time, unshakable. Outside the palace walls, however, the Mediterranean stirred with unease. Octavian grew more powerful, the Senate more divided. Rumors of war drifted across the sea like dark clouds on the horizon. Cleopatra, always alert, knew that storms would come. Yet still she walked with Antony. Still she held her banquets. Still she nurtured the vision of a world where love and strategy might coexist. For now, in the calm before the storm, Alexandria remained radiant. The queen and the general lived as though time itself had slowed for them, offering its gifts of laughter, music, and shared dreams. And those who watched, whether courtiers or common folk, could not help but feel they were witnessing something larger than life, a union that shimmered like sunlight upon the Nile, beautiful, fleeting, unforgettable. As seasons passed, the warmth of Alexandria's indulgence could not fully shelter Cleopatra and Antony from the winds of Rome. Across the Mediterranean, Octavian, quiet, calculating, younger than Antony but tireless in his ambition, was carefully weaving his own net of influence. Where Antony lived in the brilliance of spectacle and passion, Octavian built power in the shadows, with words, with laws, with carefully chosen allies. Rome itself was restless. Senators grumbled at the thought of Antony, their commander, living far away in Egypt, surrounded by Egyptian wealth, Egyptian gods, and an Egyptian queen. Whispers began to circulate that Antony had abandoned Roman virtue, that he was seduced, even enslaved, by Cleopatra's charms. The whispers hardened into speeches, speeches into propaganda. Octavian, ever skilled with words, began to paint Antony not as Rome's loyal son, but as a traitor to its spirit. Cleopatra, who knew the potency of image, understood the danger. She and Antony might live in joy within Alexandria's palaces, but reputation travelled across seas faster than ships. Already, Roman poets and pamphleteers were shaping her likeness into something monstrous. Not a queen devoted to her kingdom, but a temptress who drained men of their will. She had seen this before, how powerful women were turned into myths of ruin, and she knew that to survive, she would need to counter these stories not with denial, but with presence. Thus she and Antony appeared together in ceremonies meant to radiate strength. They sat side by side upon golden thrones, robed in garments of pharaohs and gods, receiving delegations not as a Roman general and an Egyptian queen, but as rulers of equal power. At times, Antony granted lands and titles to Cleopatra's children, including Caesarion. It was a gesture not only of affection, but of politics, proclaiming to the world that Cleopatra's dynasty was bound to his. To Octavian, this was almost intolerable. It suggested not only partnership, but succession, a new line of rulers that might eclipse Rome's authority itself. And yet, in Alexandria, daily life continued with a rhythm both slow and sweet. The river Nile still rose and fell, feeding the fields. Fishermen still cast their nets beneath the sunday. Within the palace, Cleopatra and Antony shared evenings of quiet counsel. By lamplight, they spread maps across low tables, tracing the edges of the world with their fingers, weighing where loyalty might hold and where it might falter. Antony would sigh, his brow furrowed, his thoughts restless. He was a man made for action, for battles and marches, not for endless whispers of politics. Cleopatra, calm and deliberate, would remind him that sometimes the longest victories were won not with swords, but with patience. She knew he struggled, torn between Rome's duties and Alexandria's allure. But she also knew that within her presence he found something he could not release. The feeling of being truly seen, not just as a general or politician, but as a man. Yet Rome's voices grew louder. Octavian spread stories that Cleopatra had bewitched Antony, that she had stolen his Roman honor. One tale told that Antony had promised her half of the empire, another that he knelt to her as though she were a goddess, while Rome starved. The details were exaggerated, even invented, but the stories carried weight. The Senate, anxious and divided, found itself more often leaning toward Octavian's version of truth. For Cleopatra, the struggle was not only about her image, but about her kingdom's survival. Egypt had weathered centuries of storms, yet never had its fate been so tied to the will of foreign rulers. She understood that if Antony fell, she would not merely lose a companion, but the shield that kept Egypt free from Rome's direct grasp. So she strengthened her alliances, she gathered her resources, she reminded Antony of what they could achieve together. In these years, the tension between illusion and reality sharpened. The vision Cleopatra and Antony shared of a Mediterranean bound by their union, of East and West woven into harmony, shimmered like a dream upon the water. But the tides of history were shifting. Octavian's patience was that of a hunter waiting for his prey to step too far into the open. Still, in the gardens of Alexandria, there were nights when the weight of all this seemed to dissolve. Cleopatra and Antony would sit beneath the stars, the air alive with the scent of jasmine, their hands resting lightly upon each other's. They would laugh softly, remembering moments of play, of banquets, of whispered jokes only they understood. In those hours, the world's noise faded, and there remained only two people, bound together by both desire and necessity, trying to hold back the future with the fragile strength of love. It is perhaps in this tension that their story becomes so enduring. For though the politics grew darker and the speeches harsher, Cleopatra and Antony's bond held fast. It was as if they were determined to prove that even amid storms, one could still carve out islands of peace. Their feasts, their laughter, their shared plans were not mere indulgence, but defiance, a way of saying that life could be more than war, more than ambition, more than fear. But history, steady and unyielding, continued its march. Rome prepared itself, silently, for the conflict that would decide not only Antony's fate, but Cleopatra's, and indeed, the future of Egypt itself. And so, as the lamps dimmed in the palace halls and the Nile's waters whispered past, Cleopatra knew that the days ahead would demand more than charm, more than celebration. They would demand endurance, the kind of endurance she had learned from her ancestors, who built monuments that still stood against the desert wind. For now, though, she rested beside Antony and let the night carry them gently into dreams. In time, the murmur of discontent in Rome became a steady drumbeat. Octavian, deliberate in his craft, gathered each rumour, each exaggeration, each whispered doubt about Antony and Cleopatra, and wove them into a tapestry of accusation. He presented Antony as a man no longer Roman, a man who had traded his toga for silken robes, his discipline for indulgence, his loyalty for love. He declared to the Senate that Antony had been seduced by Cleopatra into betraying the empire, into planning a new Rome, not upon the Tiber, but upon the Nile. For the senators, weary of civil war, yet always wary of losing their power, the choice was quietly being prepared for them. Octavian promised order, stability, the preservation of Rome's traditions. Antony, in their eyes, seemed further away with each passing season, his heart drawn deeper into the east, his steps more firmly planted upon Egyptian soil. Cleopatra, sensing the shifting winds, understood the danger. She had always known that love, though powerful, could not by itself guard a throne, and so she prepared. In the shipyards of Egypt, new vessels were crafted, great ships with high prows and gilded figureheads, built to shine like guardians upon the sea. Her treasury, carefully managed, was open to fund armies, supplies, the vast machinery of war. Though her court still held its feasts and its laughter, beneath the surface there was now a constant rhythm of readiness, a quiet heartbeat of preparation. Antony, too, gathered his legions. He had long been admired by his soldiers, who followed him not out of fear, but out of loyalty earned on dusty battlefields. They remembered his generosity, his willingness to share their hardships, his laughter around the fire after long marches. When he called, they came, though many wondered why their commander seemed now to fight for something less clear than conquest, less tangible than duty. Still, they trusted him, as they always had. Together, Cleopatra and Antony imagined a world bound not by rivalry but by unity. Egypt and Rome joined, East and West balanced, power shared rather than seized. It was a vision fragile yet intoxicating. To their friends, it seemed almost possible. To their enemies, it was a threat too great to ignore. Meanwhile, Octavian prepared as well, though not with gold or spectacle. His weapons were discipline and control. His fleets were fewer but leaner. His armies were organized with precision. And in Rome, his speeches worked as steadily as his soldiers. By the time he declared war, not upon Antony, but upon Cleopatra, the foreign queen, the eternal temptress, the people were ready to listen. War against Cleopatra was easier to justify than war against Antony, a Roman citizen and general. By casting her as the enemy, Octavian framed himself as the protector of Rome against an outsider's corruption. Cleopatra heard these words from across the sea, and though she did not tremble, she recognized their danger. Words could be sharper than swords, and Octavian's words were shaping a tide that might sweep across the world. Still, she placed her faith in the vision she and Antony shared. Together, they would not bow. Together, they would prove stronger. And so, preparations deepened. The harbours of Alexandria grew crowded with ships, their sails furled, their decks stacked with supplies. Soldiers drilled in the courtyards, their shields gleaming in the Sunday messengers, rode swiftly along dusty roads, carrying orders, news, and reassurances. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath, alive with movement, yet heavy with expectation. But amid all this, life did not cease. The Nile still flooded in its season, blessing the fields with fertile silt. Children still played in alleyways, chasing one another with laughter. Priests still lit incense in the temples, prayers rising like smoke toward the heavens. And in the evenings, when the business of war grew too heavy, Cleopatra and Antony would retreat into the gentler chambers of the palace, where oil lamps glowed softly, and the air carried the perfume of lotus and myrrh. There, away from the stern faces of generals and the endless demands of messengers, they allowed themselves to rest. Cleopatra would recline upon cushions, her voice low and measured, speaking of Egypt's history, its deserts, its temples, its gods who had endured for centuries. Antony would listen, his rough hands tracing idle patterns on the fabric beside him, finding comfort in the rhythm of her speech. For a little while, war seemed far away, and they could believe in the stillness of the present moment. Yet always, morning returned, and with it came the calls of duty. Fleets must be inspected, alliances secured, strategies debated. Their lives were a balance between the tenderness of night and the urgency of day. It was a balance they held with care, though both knew that the scales could not remain steady forever. The stage was being set, quietly but inexorably, for the great confrontation that history would later call Actium, a place where sea and sky would meet, where wind and tide would carry not only ships but the weight of empires. And though neither Cleopatra nor Antony could yet see the battle in detail, both felt its shadow stretching nearer. It lingered at the edges of every feast, every council, every shared glance. It whispered in the silence after laughter faded, in the stillness before sleep claimed them. The knowledge that their love, their kingdom, their very lives were moving toward a trial that could not be escaped. For now, though, Alexandria continued to shine. Lanterns glowed along its streets at night, casting golden reflections upon the water. Musicians played their soft songs in courtyards, and the scent of cooking drifted through the air. The city lived as it always had, beautiful and alive, even as history drew near with its heavy hand. And so, beneath that same night sky, Cleopatra closed her eyes and let the Nile's eternal murmur carry her thoughts. She would face whatever storm came, as she had always done, with patience, with resolve, with the quiet dignity of a queen. As the seasons shifted once more, the Mediterranean began to stir with the quiet signs of movement. Traders whispered of fleets gathering, of harbours filling, of soldiers marching along dusty roads that led to the sea. The winds of war were rising, though they carried with them not only the scent of battle, but also the slower, heavier sense of inevitability. For Cleopatra, each dawn seemed to arrive with a double weight. She awoke not only to the duties of her court, but also to the knowledge that history itself was drawing closer, like a shadow stretching across the horizon. Her mornings were filled with consultations, admirals bringing maps marked with harbours and currents, generals listing provisions and the morale of their men, priests interpreting omens in the patterns of birds and the movements of the stars. And yet, in between these pressing tasks, she found herself pausing, often at the sight of the Nile glowing in the sun, at the laughter of her children, at the soft rustle of silk as she walked through the palace corridors. There was a sense that these moments, too, mattered, that in the face of uncertainty, the smallest fragments of peace became precious treasures to hold. Antony, too, moved with the knowledge that his choices were carrying him to a point beyond which there would be no return. He rode among his soldiers, speaking to them with the same humour and warmth that had earned their loyalty years before. Around the campfires, men still laughed at his jokes, still raised their cups when he passed. But in their eyes there was a question they did not voice. Would their commander's heart remain in Rome, or had it drifted fully to Egypt's queen? The answer, though unspoken, was visible in the way Antony leaned toward Cleopatra when they stood together, in the way his gaze softened when hers met his. To his enemies, it was proof of corruption. To his friends, it was the mark of a man who had chosen love above ambition. To Antony himself, it was simply truth. The fleets that were being prepared told their own story. Cleopatra's ships, taller and more ornate, seemed almost to carry the wealth of Egypt upon their decks. Their sails, dyed in vivid colours, caught the light like banners of defiance. Antony's Roman vessels, sturdier and more compact, were made for discipline rather than display. Side by side, they formed a strange alliance, part pageant, part war machine, each reflecting the world from which it had come. As the weeks passed, omens were sought more frequently. In the temples, priests burned incense, watching how the smoke twisted in the air. Astrologers mapped the movements of the planets, noting alignments that seemed to speak of great trials to come. Some whispered warnings, others offered reassurance. Cleopatra listened to them all, yet in her heart she trusted most the counsel of her own reason. Stars and birds might hint at fate, but it was ships and soldiers that decided wars. Still, she did not dismiss the weight of symbolism. Egypt had always lived with its gods as constant companions, woven into daily life as firmly as the Nile itself, and so she honoured the rituals, pouring offerings of wine and honey, bowing her head beneath the sacred chants. It was not fear that guided her, but respect for the traditions that had carried her people through centuries. In quieter hours, she spoke with Antony about the road ahead. They would sit in chambers lit by a single lamp, maps spread across the table between them. His hand would rest upon the edge of the parchment, her finger tracing lines across the sea routes. They discussed where to meet Octavian's forces, how to position their fleets, how best to balance strength with caution. Yet beneath the words lingered another layer, unspoken, a hope that somehow, through courage or fortune, they might preserve the life they had built together. The thought of Actium, though they did not yet know it by name, hovered like a distant storm. It was not a matter of if, but when. Each plan they made, each messenger dispatched, each ship launched, was another step closer to that moment when the sails would rise, and the oars would churn the water, and history would lean forward to watch. And still, Alexandria glowed. At dusk, the city's lamps lit up the streets like strands of gold. The scent of bread and herbs drifted from open windows. Children played by the harbours, chasing one another while the towering ships loomed behind them. To a casual eye, it might have seemed as though life was untouched by war. Yet to those who listened closely, the city's heartbeat had changed. Beneath the music of flutes and the rhythm of hammers in the shipyards, there was a tension, a waiting. Cleopatra walked through the city often, veiled but unhidden. She wanted her people to see her, to know that their queen was not cloistered in fear, but among them, preparing as they prepared. She stopped to greet merchants, to listen to farmers speak of the harvest, to offer coins to mothers who carried infants on their hips. In return, they offered her prayers, blessings, words of loyalty. For Cleopatra, it was these small exchanges more than speeches, more than rituals that reminded her what she was fighting for. Night after night, she returned to the palace, weary yet steady. There, her children would climb into her lap, their voices carrying questions both innocent and profound. "Will there be war, mother?" they asked. And she would answer with gentleness, telling them that Egypt was strong, that their father was brave, that the gods watched over them. The truth was more complex, but for them, simplicity was kindness. And then, when silence returned to the chambers, she allowed herself to breathe, to sit in stillness, listening to the muffled sounds of the city beyond the walls, to let her thoughts drift, not only to the weight of tomorrow, but also to the fragile beauty of the present. For in those moments, she understood that life was not only measured in battles won or lost, but in the quiet hours of love and connection that endured even in the shadow of war. Thus the stage continued to set itself, slowly, inevitably. The fleets moved nearer to their purpose, the armies waited, the omens multiplied, and Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, stood at the heart of it all, calm, resolved, carrying both her people's hopes and her own fragile dreams, as the tide of history rose ever closer. The summer winds gathered across the Aegean, their steady breath filling the sails of ships that rocked gently in the harbours. Ropes creaked, oars dipped, and the water gleamed with shifting colours beneath the rising sunday. The sea, ever patient, seemed almost indifferent to the destiny it was about to witness. For Cleopatra and Antony, however, each wave carried both promise and peril. Their fleets were vast. Cleopatra's ships, taller and broader, moved with a stately grace, adorned with sails dyed crimson and gold. Their decks carried not only soldiers and weapons, but also the marks of Egyptian craftsmanship: polished wood, gleaming bronze, carvings of falcons and lotus flowers that whispered of an ancient kingdom's pride. Antony's Roman galleys, leaner and faster, cut through the water with disciplined precision. Together, the two navies represented not just an alliance of power, but a fusion of worlds. Rome's discipline paired with Egypt's wealth, Antony's ambition braided with Cleopatra's determination. The harbours of Alexandria became a stage for this preparation. Merchants sold provisions to sailors, figs and dates, salted fish, jars of grain, blacksmiths hammered out spearheads, their steady rhythm echoing through the alleys. Ropemakers coiled thick lengths of hemp, while carpenters repaired oars worn from practice. The city lived in a state of both tension and expectation, its people both proud to serve their queen and anxious about the war that edged ever nearer. Antony himself was often seen among his men. He did not retreat to the safety of the palace, but rode along the harbours, inspecting vessels, calling out to captains, even sharing meals at the edge of the docks. His soldiers still adored him. They spoke of his humour, his strength, his ability to drink and laugh as one of their own. Yet beneath the loyalty, a question pulsed quietly. Was their commander fully theirs, or had his fate become bound too tightly to that of Egypt's queen? Cleopatra, meanwhile, moved in quiet strength. She visited the shipyards, her presence a symbol as powerful as any speech. When she walked among the workers, veiled but unmistakable, men straightened their backs, women offered blessings, children gazed wide-eyed. To her people, she was not merely a monarch, she was Egypt itself, walking in flesh and blood, guiding them through uncertainty. In the palace, her evenings were often spent with scrolls spread across polished tables. Advisors whispered of strategies, whether to confront Octavian at sea or lure him to land, whether to rely on Egypt's heavier ships or the agility of Rome's smaller vessels. Cleopatra listened carefully, weighing each voice. She knew this was not simply Antony's war, it was Egypt's survival. To yield control to others would be to surrender her kingdom's destiny, and she refused to do so. Antony and Cleopatra often conferred in private. They spoke in low tones, sometimes over maps inked with coastlines and harbours, sometimes in chambers lit only by flickering oil lamps. She would point to currents she had studied, to harbours where supplies might falter. He, in turn, would recall the discipline of Roman legions, the way his men could endure where others might falter. Their exchanges were not always easy. Pride and passion made them fierce debaters, but beneath it all lay the steady rhythm of trust. And yet, doubts crept in from beyond their walls. Messengers arrived with word of Octavian's growing strength. His propaganda spread across Rome, portraying Antony as bewitched, enslaved by the charms of a foreign queen. To Roman ears, Cleopatra was not Egypt's proud monarch, but a temptress undermining Roman virtue. Antony, once a hero of the Republic, was painted as a man who had abandoned his duty. These words, repeated often enough, began to stain reputations, long before the first swords clashed. For Cleopatra, such whispers were not new. She had endured rumours her entire reign, and she knew well how easily truth was drowned in the tide of fear. Still, she felt their sting, not for herself, but for what they meant to Antony. He was a man of honour, and to see his name twisted into mockery troubled her deeply. In private, she sought to reassure him. "History has many voices," she said softly, "but it is the actions we take now that shape which voice will endure." Antony, though proud, took comfort in her steadiness. He had always been a man of action rather than reflection, and in Cleopatra, he found both the mirror and the anchor he needed. Together, they pressed forward, though both could feel the world closing in around them. As summer deepened, the fleets grew restless. Crews longed for motion, for the open sea. The days of waiting wore on the men as much as hunger or thirst might have. Fights broke out on the docks, tempers flared among captains, and the strain of anticipation began to weigh heavily. It was then that Antony gave the order. The fleets would move, slowly at first, in small squadrons, then in greater numbers. The ships slipped out from Alexandria, their sails swelling with the sea breeze. Cleopatra watched from the palace balcony as the horizon filled with silhouettes ships, stretching like an arm of destiny into the water. She stood silently, her children at her side, her hand resting lightly upon the stone railing. In that moment, there was no grandeur, no pageantry, only the quiet truth of what lay ahead. War was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The fleet's progress was measured, cautious, yet steady. Each port they reached, each coastline they traced, carried them closer to the inevitable. Along the way, omens continued to be sought. Birds flying eastward were seen as favourable, storms as warnings. Priests murmured blessings, sailors clutched charms. Cleopatra, though respectful of these rituals, trusted more in preparation than superstition. Her focus was unshaken. Egypt would endure, no matter the outcome. In the evenings, as their ships anchored in sheltered bays, the Queen walked the decks. The sailors watched her pass in silence, their eyes following the gleam of her robes, the calm authority in her bearing. She spoke to them not with grand declarations, but with simple words of encouragement, reminders of the strength they carried as Egypt's sons. Those moments, quiet and human, stitched a bond between ruler and ruled that no fear could unravel. And so the fleets moved steadily onward, through days of sunlit calm and nights lit by stars. The water carried them, the wind urged them, and history itself seemed to lean closer, waiting. Ahead, Actium lay unseen, but already its shadow reached across the sea. The waters around Greece held a peculiar stillness, as though the sea itself knew what was coming. It was not yet the clash of steel or the roar of battle, but something quieter, the charged silence of forces gathered, waiting for a signal. Off the western coast, near the small promontory of Actium, Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet found its place. The ships anchored in neat formations, their oars drawn in, their sails lowered to rest. From a distance, the fleet looked like a forest upon the water, countless masts rising like trees, their lines crisscrossing against the pale sky. Egyptian vessels, tall and splendid, bore painted prows, shaped like falcons, lions, and crocodiles. Roman galleys, sharper and more compact, lined themselves in disciplined ranks. The bay itself became a harbour of nations, languages, and loyalties mingled together, all bound by the looming shadow of Octavian's forces. Cleopatra often walked the decks of her flagship, a vessel grander than most. Its hull was strengthened, its decorations subtle but dignified. She moved with composure, her presence a silent reassurance to those who watched her. To the sailors, she seemed almost unearthly, a queen who had brought her kingdom into the heart of foreign waters, a woman unshaken by the murmur of enemies who claimed she had no place here. Each evening, as dusk softened the horizon, fires burned along the shorelines. The men cooked their rations, the smoke drifting gently across the bay. From the decks came the sound of quiet songs, Roman marching chants, Egyptian hymns, Greek ballads carried by mercenaries. The mingling of voices gave the nights a strange, almost dreamlike texture, as though the war they awaited was already half forgotten in the haze of music and firelight. Antony, for his part, paced often, his thoughts unsteady between confidence and doubt. He was a soldier who preferred swift decisions, the crash of action, over the slow erosion of waiting. Yet here, at Actium, he was forced into patience. Octavian's fleet lingered nearby, not striking, not retreating, a mirror presence across the sea. Both sides watched one another, measuring strength, studying movements. It was in these days that anxiety grew among Antony's men. Supplies ran low. The shorelines could not always sustain such numbers. Hunger gnawed more insistently than any rumour of battle. Worse still, desertions began to whisper through the camps. A handful of Roman officers slipped away under night's cover, their loyalty to Antony faltering under the weight of Octavian's promises. These defections were like small stones dropped into calm water. Their ripples spread farther than one might expect. Cleopatra was not blind to these signs. In private, she urged Antony to act swiftly before his strength was weakened by delay. Yet her voice was steady, never panicked. "Time is a tide," she told him quietly one night, as lanterns swayed in the harbour breeze. "If we linger too long upon its edge, it carries us where we do not wish to go." Antony listened, torn between his instinct for action and his fear of risking too much too soon. In the city of Actium itself, local villagers and merchants watched the gathering of powers with a mixture of awe and unease. They sold goods when they could, but many fled inland, unwilling to be caught between giants. The land felt altered by the presence of so many soldiers, so many ships. The olive groves and hills, long used to quiet lives, now bore witness to whispers of empire and fate. The days unfolded slowly, one after another, like beads strung along a cord. The tension became its own kind of burden, heavier even than swords or shields. Soldiers sharpened blades that might never strike. Captains practiced maneuvers that remained hypothetical. And all the while, Octavian's forces loomed just out of reach, their sails visible on the horizon, their silence as menacing as any declaration. At night, Cleopatra sometimes withdrew to her chambers aboard the flagship. She would unroll maps, trace the coastlines with her fingertips, and measure the distances with calm precision. Her mind reached beyond the immediate discomforts of hunger and waiting. She thought of Egypt, its farmers, its temples, its children asleep under the Nile's stars. She thought of her ancestors, the long line of Ptolemies who had ruled before her, and the weight of their legacy upon her shoulders. Yet even in solitude, her thoughts were not without comfort. She carried with her tokens from home, small charms of ivory and gold, a papyrus scroll inscribed with verses, a vial of perfume whose scent recalled the gardens of Alexandria. These objects, fragile yet enduring, reminded her that beyond war and politics, there were still moments of beauty worth protecting. Antony, too, found his moments of reflection. He would sit on the shore, staring into the waves that lapped against the rocks. The sea had always been less familiar to him than the land. He was a man born for marching, not sailing. Yet here he was, his fate tied to the currents and winds, his future dependent upon battles fought upon water. He thought often of Rome, of the city he had once called his home. He wondered if he would ever walk its streets again, or if Rome had already turned its back on him forever. As August waned, the heat grew oppressive. Tempers flared more easily, patience thinned. Yet still, no clash came. It was as though both Antony and Octavian hesitated, each wary of being the one to strike first and fail. The men felt it keenly, that sense of waiting for something vast and unstoppable, and though they could not name it, they knew they were standing in the long shadow of history. For Cleopatra, there was no shrinking from what lay ahead. She moved among her people with poise, spoke to Antony with clarity, and kept her gaze fixed upon the horizon. If there was fear within her, it was hidden beneath layers of resolve. She had survived palace intrigues, betrayals, shifting allegiances, and the harsh eyes of Rome itself. Now, she faced the sea and whatever destiny Actium would bring. And so the fleets lingered, two vast presences staring across the water at one another. The days slowed, the air thickened, and every sunset seemed to ask the same quiet question: when? The morning that would become legend did not arrive with fanfare. It began, as so many mornings had, with a thin veil of mist upon the water, the soft cry of seabirds rising from the rocky shores. The horizon held its pale glow, the sun not yet fully risen, and the air carried the damp coolness of night that had not quite surrendered to day. In Antony's camp, the soldiers awoke slowly, stretching their limbs, murmuring in low voices as they prepared for another day of waiting. They had grown accustomed to this rhythm, the endless sharpening of blades, the polishing of armor, the checking of supplies. Yet beneath the routine, there was a subtle difference in the air, a tension not unlike the moment before a storm breaks. Men glanced more often at the horizon, their movements a touch quicker, as though some unseen hand nudged them forward. Cleopatra, ever attuned to the moods of her people, sensed it too. She rose early, her attendants dressing her in garments of deep blue, the colour of the Nile at dusk. Around her neck she wore a simple chain of gold, not heavy, but sufficient to catch the light when she moved. She stepped out onto the deck of her flagship, where the boards were still slick with dew, and let her eyes travel across the bay. The sea was calm, but in its calmness lay an unease, the sort of stillness that precedes sudden motion. From the Roman side of the camp, horns sounded, their notes carrying faintly across the water. The men stirred, looking to their captains, who themselves looked to Antony. He had not yet given orders, but his presence was felt everywhere. Tall, broad-shouldered, his features weathered by war, Antony carried himself with the gravity of one who knew what was at stake. Yet beneath his outer bearing, he wrestled with choices that had no easy answers. For weeks, he had hesitated. Now, hesitation was no longer possible. Supplies dwindled, morale faltered, and Octavian's forces only grew stronger the longer the waiting dragged on. To retreat was to surrender dignity. To linger was to starve. And so, the decision pressed upon him, as heavy as any burden he had borne, to act now, or lose everything. Cleopatra approached him that morning. Their conversation was quiet, for the ears of no one but themselves. She did not speak in tones of desperation, nor in fiery exhortations. Her voice was calm, deliberate, like the measured rhythm of waves against stone. "The tide has turned, Marcus," she said softly. "It carries us forward whether we will it or not." Antony nodded. There was no need for more words. The moment had arrived. Orders were given, messengers sent across the harbour, signals prepared to rouse the fleet into motion. By mid-morning, the ships stirred like a vast creature awakening. Oars dipped into the sea, sending ripples across the surface. Sailors shouted, ropes tightened, sails unfurled. The air filled with the creak of wood, the slap of canvas, the sharp ring of commands. From Cleopatra's flagship, the view was one of controlled chaos, lines of vessels aligning themselves, prows cutting toward the open water, banners lifting in the breeze. On the opposite horizon, Octavian's fleet answered, their formations tightened, their own banners rising. The sea between them narrowed, not in distance, but in inevitability. For years, Rome had been divided, its generals locked in endless rivalry. Here, at Actium, the division found its reckoning. And yet, even in this gathering of power, there was a strange, almost dreamlike quality to the moment. The sunlight danced on the waves, scattering jewels across the surface. Gulls wheeled overhead, indifferent to the affairs of empires. The ships moved with grace, as much as menace, their oars rising and falling in unison, like the steady breathing of some enormous being. Among the men, fear and resolve mingled. Some whispered prayers to their gods, clutching small tokens for protection. Others steadied themselves with silence, their faces set like stone. The clash to come was beyond any one soldier's control. All they could do was hold their places, trust their captains, and brace for the storm. Cleopatra remained visible upon her deck, her posture upright, her gaze fixed. She knew eyes were upon her, not only from her own sailors, but from Antony's men as well. In her composure, they found a measure of steadiness. Whatever rumors had circulated about her influence, her presence now was undeniable. She was not a hidden figure behind the curtain, but a queen standing before her people, her fate entwined with theirs. The hours stretched, though each seemed briefer than the last. The fleets moved closer, adjusting formations, maneuvering into positions that centuries of naval warfare had taught. Octavian's commander, Agrippa, a man of rare skill upon the sea, directed his forces with precision. Antony, bold yet untested in such waters, placed his faith in the strength of his ships and the courage of his allies. Then came the silence, that deep, almost unbearable silence, when both sides were poised, waiting for the first strike. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the sea stilled, as though it too awaited the moment when history would break open. From Cleopatra's vantage, the line of Octavian's fleet stretched like a dark wall across the horizon. The space between them was narrow now, a corridor of water that would soon be filled with splintering wood, shouts, fire, and blood. And yet, for that single heartbeat of stillness, it was as though nothing had yet been lost. Antony raised his hand, the signal given. Horns blared across the bay. Drums thundered. Oars struck in unison. The fleet surged forward, Cleopatra's flagship among them, her golden prows cutting through the water. The day had come. It is said that on that morning, as the ships met, the sea itself roared with the sound of war, the clash of hull against hull, the cry of men, the rush of fire arrows streaking across the sky. But before that storm, before the first strike, there had been this quieter pause stretched across sea and sky, fragile as glass, vast as eternity. And for Cleopatra, for Antony, for every soldier and sailor present, that pause was the last moment of peace they would ever know. The stillness did not last. It could not. Like a taut string, stretched to its breaking point, the silence of that morning snapped as Antony's fleet lurched forward, oars biting into the sea with fierce rhythm. From Cleopatra's flagship, the motion was steady, deliberate, yet across the line. One could feel the tension unravel into noise, into chaos, into the din of a battle that would shape empires. The first strikes came swiftly. Octavian's ships, sleek and tightly disciplined, maneuvered with precision under Agrippa's command. Their oars dipped like wings in perfect synchrony, carrying them into position to hem in Antony's heavier vessels. Arrows soared from both sides, their tips glinting in the sunlight, before vanishing into the air with a hiss and a thud. The cries of men rose, sharp and raw, as the first found their mark. Cleopatra stood upon her deck, hands resting lightly on the rail, her face composed, though her heart must have pounded beneath the calm exterior. Ah, she had prepared for this, but no preparation could fully still the tremor of witnessing war at such proximity. Around her, sailors hauled lines, tightened sails, braced for collision. The creak of timbers and the rush of water mingled with the steady beat of drums, calling rowers into unison. Antony's flagship surged forward, his standard rising high above the decks, a beacon to his men. His orders carried across the sea, firm and commanding, urging his fleet into formation. Yet the advantage slipped quickly toward Octavian's forces. Agrippa's tactics, swift, precise, merciless, had been honed in countless campaigns. Antony's men fought bravely, but the sea was not their element. Soon the crash of ships against one another filled the air. Roman galleys rammed into Egyptian hulls, iron-tipped prows tearing through wood with sickening force. Splinters rained down. Men tumbled into the churning waters, cries of anguish echoing across the bay. Grappling hooks flew, chains clattered, and boarding parties surged across decks in vicious melee. Steel met steel, the clang ringing like harsh music, punctuated by shouts, curses, and the desperate cries of the wounded. The sea itself seemed to convulse. Fire broke out on one vessel, its sails catching in a rush of orange flame. Smoke curled upward, blurring the horizon, filling lungs with acrid sting. Rowers pushed desperately to escape the blaze, but their cries were swallowed in the roar of battle. Through it all, Cleopatra's ships held their place, close to Antony's, neither rushing forward recklessly nor lingering in cowardice. She had pledged her fleet, and her presence steadied Antony's allies for the moment. Yet, as the hours wore on, the tide of battle pressed harder. Octavian's ships began to close the circle, their tactics tightening like a noose. It was then, when the balance tipped toward disaster, that the fateful decision came. Whether premeditated or sudden, history debates still. Some say Cleopatra, seeing the battle turn, gave the order to break through, to flee and preserve her fleet. Others say she had always intended to hold back, waiting to see where fortune lay. Whatever the cause, her flagship veered suddenly, sails straining, prows cutting eastward away from the chaos. At first it was only one ship, then 2, then 10, until her entire squadron followed, streaming out of the bay like birds startled into flight. Their departure sent ripples across the battlefield, not only upon the water, but upon the hearts of those who remained. To Antony's men, the sight was devastating. Rumors flew in an instant. Had Cleopatra betrayed them? Had she abandoned their cause? Or was this retreat part of some secret design? Antony himself saw her sails catch the wind, her ship surging towards safety. In that moment, history tells us, he made his choice. Against the counsel of reason, against the pleas of his commanders, he turned his own vessel to follow her. Love, loyalty, or desperation, perhaps all three entwined, drew him from the heart of battle, leaving his fleet without its leader. The consequences were swift and merciless. Without Antony's command, confusion spread among his men. Some continued to fight, clashing with Octavian's ships in hopeless fury. Others faltered, their morale broken, their faith shaken. Agrippa seized the opening with ruthless precision. His forces pressed the attack, isolating and overwhelming Antony's scattered ships. One by one, they were sunk, captured, or consumed by fire. By afternoon, the bay was littered with wreckage. Broken masts jutted from the sea like gravestones, while bodies floated among drifting planks. Smoke hung heavy over the water, veiling the horizon in a haze of ash. Octavian's fleet stood triumphant, their banners rising unchallenged above the ruin. But far to the east, Cleopatra's ships sailed on, their prows cutting cleanly through the open sea. Antony followed in her wake, the thunder of battle fading behind him. To some, it was cowardice. To others, devotion. To Cleopatra, it may have been survival, for without preservation of her fleet, Egypt itself would fall before the might of Rome. Yet survival carried its own price, and the cost of this retreat would echo far beyond the waters of Actium. For in that single turning, in that flight across the waves, Antony and Cleopatra sealed their fate. The world saw not strategy, but defeat, not cunning, but desertion. And Octavian, ever the master of perception, would wield that image like a weapon sharper than any blade. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, its light glimmering upon waters strewn with wreckage, the shape of empire shifted. Rome's future bent toward Octavian, the man who would soon name himself Augustus. And Antony, once Rome's brightest general, found himself drifting not toward triumph, but toward tragedy. On her flagship, Cleopatra must have stood upon the deck, eyes fixed forward, the wind in her hair, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what had just transpired. Behind her, smoke rose into the sky, marking the end of Antony's hopes and the beginning of the long, inevitable fall. The battle was lost, yet the sea did not grieve. Its waves moved on as they always had, steady and unbothered, lapping against the prows of Cleopatra's ships as they made their way toward the coast of Egypt. Behind them, the wreckage of Actium smouldered, but ahead stretched calm waters, the kind that conceal rather than confess. For Antony and Cleopatra, the retreat carried both relief and despair. They had escaped the slaughter, yet their reputation had not. To the world, Octavian had won, and they had fled. What stories the survivors of Actium would tell could not be silenced. Rumour travels faster than sails in the wind, and long before the fleet reached Alexandria, whispers of betrayal and cowardice were already moving across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra must have felt the weight of every oarstroke. Her ships had survived, yes, but survival had come at the cost of trust. Antony's commanders, men who had fought with him for years, found themselves questioning the queen whose sails had led their leader away. Was she the reason they had abandoned the field? Had love overruled duty? And yet, in the privacy of their shared quarters, away from the watchful eyes of men, Antony and Cleopatra must have found comfort in one another's presence. The world could rage with accusations, but between them, the bond was real. They had wagered everything, their thrones, their futures on each other. Now, together, they bore the burden of that choice. The journey home was quiet, marked more by silence than by strategy. The men rode without cheer. The officers spoke in hushed tones. Cleopatra moved among her sailors with regal calm, offering encouragement where she could, her words soft but steady. Antony, once the embodiment of martial vigor, seemed subdued, his thoughts drawn inward, his face shadowed by the memory of what had slipped from his grasp. When the fleet at last reached Alexandria, the city welcomed its queen with relief, but also with unease. From the harbour walls, the citizens strained to read the truth in the sails. Had their queen triumphed, or had she been defeated? Rumours of Octavian's strength had already reached Egyptian ears, and the sight of Cleopatra returning with her fleet intact, yet without the laurels of victory, stirred more questions than comfort. Inside the palace, Cleopatra wasted no time. She understood that the people needed reassurance, and she gave it. Banquets were held, processions arranged, gifts distributed to the temples of the gods. She appeared in public draped in gold, her children by her side, smiling with practiced ease, her voice as steady as the Nile in flood. Whatever storm raged outside her borders, within Egypt she projected calm and abundance. But Antony was another matter. The man who had once commanded legions with effortless authority now moved through the palace like a figure carved from stone. His pride had been struck at Actium, and wounds of pride bleed deeper than those of the flesh. He withdrew into drinking, into silence, into sudden bursts of anger or laughter that revealed the turmoil within. Cleopatra, for her part, did not waver. She had always been pragmatic, always aware that appearances could shape reality. If Antony faltered, then she would remain the steady hand. Yet she must have known, deep down, that the sands were shifting beneath them both. Octavian would not rest. His victory at Actium was not an end, but a beginning. Already, his messengers carried news of triumph back to Rome, where senators and citizens alike hailed him as the saviour of the Republic. Soon, he would turn his eyes fully upon Egypt. Still, the days in Alexandria continued with a strange rhythm, at once fragile and beautiful. The city itself seemed untouched by war, its streets bustling, its markets loud with barter and song. Along the canals, fishermen cast their nets, children played among the reeds, and priests conducted their rituals with incense rising into the sky. For a while, it was possible to imagine that nothing had changed, that Cleopatra remained the queen of a prosperous, independent land. Yet beneath that surface lay quiet preparation. Cleopatra ordered fortifications strengthened, granaries stocked, and ships repaired. She knew what was coming, even if she did not speak of it openly. Antony, too, roused himself at times to review troops, to plan defences, to hold council with loyal officers. But there was a hollowness in it, a sense that they were preparing not for victory, but for endurance, for the long, slow decline that follows a single, irreversible loss. At night, when the city fell silent, Cleopatra may have walked alone through the palace gardens. The scent of lotus flowers drifted through the air, mingling with the quiet rush of fountains. She had always loved Alexandria at night, its sky filled with stars reflected upon the harbour waters. But now, perhaps, the stars seemed less like guides and more like distant watchers, indifferent to the struggles of those who ruled beneath them. Antony sometimes joined her. In those moments, One might imagine them not as queen and general, not as symbols of empire, but simply as man and woman, weary, vulnerable, clinging to each other in the face of an approaching tide. They could not turn back. Their laughter, when it came, was soft. Their silences, longer still. Meanwhile, in Rome, Octavian sharpened not his sword, but his words. He declared Antony a traitor to Rome, a man bewitched by an Egyptian queen, enslaved by her charms, corrupted by her luxuries. Cleopatra was painted as a temptress, a foreign poison seeping into the veins of Roman honor. Actium had given him the perfect narrative. Antony had abandoned his men for Cleopatra, choosing passion over duty. Rome would not forgive him for that. And so, in the quiet halls of Alexandria, while the gardens bloomed and the lamps burned late into the night, Cleopatra and Antony lived under a shadow that grew longer by the day. They had survived Actium, yes, but survival is not victory. It is a pause before the next storm. And though the palace walls were strong, and though the queen's will was iron, both Antony and Cleopatra must have felt it. The sense that their story was no longer wholly theirs to write. In Rome, words proved sharper than any sword. Octavian, ever the careful strategist, understood that victory at Actium was not enough. To truly dismantle Antony and Cleopatra, he needed to shape the story. And so he painted Antony as a man lost, seduced by an Eastern queen who ensnared him with luxuries and bound him with sorcery. Cleopatra became the villainess of his tale, a temptress whose beauty concealed poison, a queen whose embrace threatened the Roman way of life. These stories spread with remarkable speed. Senators repeated them, citizens whispered them, poets wove them into verses. Even those who had never seen Egypt began to imagine Cleopatra as a figure of dangerous fascination, a foreign queen who had unmade one of Rome's greatest generals. The image stuck because it was easy to believe. People often prefer simple tales, a mighty man undone by love, a cunning woman who knew how to weave spells stronger than swords. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra would have known of these rumors. News traveled by merchants, by sailors, by envoys, who came and went across the Mediterranean. But she had long understood that she could not control what Rome thought of her. What mattered was Egypt, the people within her borders, the priests, the scribes, the soldiers, and the farmers along the Nile. So she played her part with practiced grace. Public ceremonies continued. The temples glowed with offerings. The festivals unfolded with music and color, as though nothing in the world had changed. When she appeared in public, it was in gold and purple, carried on a litter, her children walking beside her, like living proof that the dynasty endured. She smiled with serenity, though she must have felt the weight of uncertainty pressing upon her with every passing day. Antony, however, could not always keep up the facade. His spirit, once larger than life, seemed bruised beyond repair. At times he rallied standing before his soldiers, promising that Rome had not yet seen the last of him, that he would rise again and face Octavian with renewed strength. But at other times he seemed withdrawn, retreating into long hours of wine and silence. The men who had followed him for years looked at him now with uneasy eyes, torn between loyalty and disillusionment. Cleopatra must have seen this. Perhaps she reminded him, gently, that Egypt was still rich, that their fleet had survived, that their people still adored them. Perhaps she urged him to see not only what was lost, but also what remained. Yet even her words could not always pierce the heaviness that lingered in Antony's heart. Still, the days carried on with their quiet rhythms. The Nile continued its eternal cycle, flooding its banks, leaving behind rich silt that farmers worked with steady hands. The markets bustled with life, fragrant with spices and noisy with barter. Children ran through the alleys laughing. The ordinary world of Egypt did not pause for politics. In the eyes of the people, their queen remained radiant, their land still abundant, but within the palace, The awareness of what loomed ahead was unavoidable. Messengers brought reports of Octavian's growing strength, of legions gathering, of ships being prepared. Each scroll carried the echo of inevitability. Cleopatra read them with steady hands, though her thoughts must have stirred with both fear and resolve. Antony read them too, sometimes tossing them aside with anger, sometimes studying them in silence, as though searching for a crack in Octavian's armor. The nights in Alexandria became all the more precious. One might imagine Cleopatra walking slowly through the palace halls, the lamplight flickering along the marble, the faint sound of music drifting from distant chambers. Antony by her side, weary but still bound to her, still drawn to the quiet strength she carried. Their conversations may have turned softer, more reflective, less about conquest and more about endurance, about the lives they had lived and the choices they had made. For Cleopatra, survival was always about adaptation. She had outlasted her siblings, navigated Rome's politics, and secured her throne through wit as much as charm. Now she faced a challenge greater than any before, the slow encroachment of a power too vast to ignore. She could not defeat Octavian in open war, but perhaps she could endure. Perhaps she could protect her children. Perhaps she could preserve Egypt's dignity even in defeat. For Antony, the struggle was more personal. He was a Roman general who had once stood among the most honored men of his age. Now, he was cast as a betrayer, a shadow of his former self. Yet in Cleopatra's company, there remained a kind of solace. If Rome rejected him, Egypt embraced him. If the Senate cursed his name, the Queen still called him beloved. That bond became both comfort and cage, a refuge from the world, but also the symbol of everything he had lost. As weeks turned into months, the inevitability of Octavian's advance grew clearer, and yet, life in Alexandria continued with its usual beauty. The gardens blossomed, the river flowed, the stars filled the night sky. Cleopatra, ever conscious of appearances, ensured that each festival and ritual unfolded with splendor, as though Egypt remained untouched by Rome's shadow. It was a strange, fragile balance, a world outwardly unchanged, inwardly trembling. The people feasted, the priests prayed, the queen smiled, the general brooded, and beyond the horizon, Octavian's legions gathered strength, like a tide rising slowly, silently, destined to wash ashore. In those quiet evenings, perhaps Cleopatra allowed herself moments of stillness, sitting in her chambers, the oil lamps casting soft light across painted walls, the sound of distant water flowing through fountains. She may have thought of her youth, of the risks she had taken, of the crowns she had worn, of the loves she had held. She may have wondered how her story would be told when she was gone. Would she be remembered as queen or temptress, as ruler or ruin? For now, though, she remained what she had always been. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, steady as the river, luminous as the stars above. The storm was coming, but until it broke, she held her world in place with quiet dignity. The seasons shifted gently in Egypt, though the land seemed timeless in its rhythms. The Nile swelled and receded, farmers sowed and harvested, and children's voices echoed through narrow streets. Yet, in the palace at Alexandria, a quiet unease stirred beneath the surface of daily life. Octavian's shadow was lengthening. His armies inched closer, not in sudden thrusts, but with the steady certainty of the Roman machine. Reports reached Cleopatra's court like the slow toll of a bell. Another city aligned with Octavian, another fleet constructed, another legion dispatched. Cleopatra listened with composure, as always. She was practiced in the art of hearing terrible news with a serene expression. The courtiers watching her would have seen only calmness, as though the fate of empires were a passing inconvenience. But inside, She must have measured every word carefully, weighing her dwindling choices. Antony, by contrast, could not always mask his mood. He paced the palace halls with restless steps. Once he had been the embodiment of Roman vigor, the kind of general whose mere presence inspired courage. Now, in private moments, frustration sometimes flickered across his face, and silence hung heavy in his conversations. He still had strength, but it was like a torch burning down bright, yet shortened. The palace, meanwhile, tried to maintain its rituals. Banquets still unfolded, though with quieter tones. Dancers still twirled, but the laughter was softer, as if muffled by something unsaid. Cleopatra presided with poise, her presence like a golden thread, stitching everything together. Without her, the splendor might have unraveled into fear. It was not just war that weighed on her mind. She thought of her children, Alexander Helios, named for the sun, Cleopatra Selene, named for the moon, and the younger Ptolemy Philadelphus. They were the legacy she hoped to preserve, even if Egypt's political independence could not endure. She must have wondered, if Octavian conquered, would he allow them to live? Would he permit them to grow into rulers, or would they be paraded as trophies in Rome? Such thoughts might have kept her awake in the quiet hours of the night. Perhaps she walked softly across her chambers, pausing by open windows to gaze at the dark waters of the harbour, the faint outline of ships rocking in the moonlight. In those moments, she would have known that all her cleverness, all her alliances, all her charm, had brought her to this precipice, where the power of Rome, inexorable and immense, pressed against her fragile walls. And yet, even with the storm approaching, life contained small beauties. The gardens of the palace bloomed with jasmine and roses. Musicians still played gentle melodies in the evening air. The sight of her children laughing together, chasing one another in marble courtyards, must have given Cleopatra a sense of fragile peace. Such moments mattered, even when the world outside threatened to collapse. Antony found solace too, in these glimpses of ordinary joy. He sometimes joined the children's games, lifting them onto his shoulders, laughing with them, his soldier's heart softened by their presence. For all his weariness, he was still a father, still a man capable of tenderness. In these moments, Cleopatra may have looked at him not as a fallen general, but simply as the companion who had shared her throne, her burdens, and her affections. But the political reality pressed on. Octavian's propaganda grew sharper, painting Cleopatra as the serpent of the Nile, Antony as her enthralled victim. To the Roman people, this narrative was intoxicating. It gave their battles a moral purpose. They were not simply fighting another general, they were saving Rome from the clutches of an Eastern queen. Cleopatra knew well the danger of stories. She herself had used spectacle and image to craft her power appearing as Isis reborn, gilded in ritual and symbol. She understood that Octavian was now playing the same game, and that in this contest of narratives, truth mattered less than perception. Rome would believe what it wished to believe, and no counter-story from Alexandria could reach its ears. So, she turned her attention inward, to Egypt itself. She met with priests, ensuring the temples remained supplied with offerings. She met with officials, ensuring grain shipments flowed smoothly along the Nile. She met with generals, urging loyalty, reminding them that their queen had not faltered. Even as the noose tightened, she worked to keep her realm steady. In the evenings, she and Antony sometimes withdrew into quieter chambers, away from courtiers and children. There, surrounded by tapestries and low lamps, they might have spoken more freely. Antony perhaps raged against his fate, lamenting the Senate's betrayal, remembering the days when his legions cheered him across continents. Cleopatra, calmer, may have reminded him that despair was a luxury they could not afford. She had lived too long on the knife's edge of power to surrender easily to grief. Still, she must have known the path ahead narrowed with each step. To fight Octavian again would be nearly impossible. To negotiate with him, perhaps futile, but to yield without resistance that went against the very core of her reign. She was Cleopatra, daughter of the Ptolemies, last pharaoh of Egypt. She had survived plots, siblings, and storms. To bow meekly now would undo everything. And so, in the deep of night, perhaps she whispered to herself the same words she had carried all her life. Endure. Endure, as the Nile endures. Endure, as the desert endures. Let the storms come. Let the tide rise. Still, she would stand, adorned not just in jewels and silks, but in resolve. For even if history was written by Rome, she could shape the ending of her story. And in that quiet certainty, the power to choose her last act, there was a strange and steady comfort. The morning it began in earnest was strangely quiet. No trumpet blasts, no sudden wave of fire raining from the ships. Instead, Alexandrians woke to a stillness too deliberate to be natural. The gulls that usually wheeled over the harbour seemed fewer, as though they sensed something stirring beneath the surface. Fishermen who had slipped out early returned swiftly, whispering of Roman ships drawing closer. Their prows angled in formation, cutting the water with silent determination. By midday, the silence cracked. The first clash was small, no more than a Roman detachment seizing a grain store outside the city's western walls. But to those who witnessed it, it felt like a signal. Dust rose, shouts rang, and the glint of steel flickered under the Sunday. It was the beginning of a rhythm. Rome advancing, Alexandria bracing, the city's pulse quickening. Cleopatra received the reports with her usual calm, though the messengers' voices shook as they recounted the ease with which the Romans advanced. "They move as if they already own the land," one said, bowing low, his forehead nearly touching the polished floor. Cleopatra dismissed him gently, then stood at her window once more, watching the horizon. The line of ships had thickened to the point where the sea itself seemed a wall of wood and sail. Antony took the opposite approach. He gathered his officers, calling for sorties, for boldness, for the kind of action that might break Octavian's grip before it tightened. He spoke of momentum, of seizing it while they still could. His commanders listened, some nodding, others hesitant. They knew what Antony knew but would not say aloud. Rome had numbers, patience, and supply. Alexandria had courage, pride, and desperation. The first real skirmish outside the Canopic Gate played out under the lowering Sunday. Antony's cavalry clashed with Roman scouts in a spray of dust and cries. Spears thrusting, hooves pounding. For a moment, Antony's men pushed the Romans back, their cheers ringing triumphantly across the fields. But Octavian's reinforcements arrived swiftly, their lines neat, their discipline unshaken. Within an hour, the cheers had faded, replaced by the grim retreat of Antony's riders toward the city walls. From the ramparts, citizens watched the battle unfold like spectators at a grim theatre. Mothers held their children close. Old men leaned on staffs. Young men muttered vows of vengeance. When Antony rode back through the gates, dirt streaking his armour and his horse lathered with sweat, they still cheered him. It was not victory they cheered, but defiance, the act of not folding. Not yet. Cleopatra, that evening, insisted on holding court as usual. She sat upon her gilded throne, a faint smile upon her lips, jewels catching the torchlight. Petitioners came before her, some with trivial matters, disputes over property lines, trade disagreements, others with desperate pleas for protection or food. She answered each with the same serenity, her voice steady even as the walls seemed to tremble with distant sounds of battle. The theatre of monarchy mattered now more than ever, but in the privacy of her chambers, she weighed options with ruthless clarity. She knew Octavian was not here to negotiate. He was here to finish a story he had already begun telling Rome. Antony corrupted by Cleopatra, Rome endangered by Eastern decadence. Still, she considered every thread of possibility. Could envoys appeal to his ambition? Could gifts sway him? Could her own presence, her legendary charm, make a dent in his armor of discipline? Antony grew more restless with each passing day. His pride bristled at the Romans' calm advance. They creep like a shadow, he spat one night, pacing the chamber. No thunder, no lightning, just this endless pressing forward. Cleopatra watched him, her voice soft. Shadows often kill without noise. He stopped then, turning to her, eyes burning. Then let us strike with noise enough for both. Yet, striking required men, and men required faith. Each skirmish chipped away at that faith. Supplies grew leaner, rumors spread in taverns and marketplaces. Octavian had promised leniency to those who surrendered, safe passage to merchants who yielded, amnesty to soldiers who abandoned Antony. Whether true or not, the whispers ate at morale. The citizens of Alexandria carried on their lives with a veneer of normalcy. Markets still opened, though goods grew scarce. Bakers sold smaller loaves. Water sellers charged more for each skin. Musicians still played in shaded courtyards, though their tunes fell quieter, wistful. The temples filled with supplicants, smoke rising from 1,000 offerings. Mothers prayed not for victory, but for mercy, for their children's survival should the gates fall. One dusk, Cleopatra walked the palace gardens with Selene. The child, though young, had already absorbed the weight of the siege. She touched the petals of a lotus bloom and asked softly, "Will these gardens still be here when I am grown?" Cleopatra paused, her hand brushing Selene's hair. "Gardens can be rebuilt," she said, her voice low. "What matters is that roots endure. Remember that, my daughter, the root endures." Selene nodded, though her eyes remained clouded with thought too deep for her years. Meanwhile, the Romans pressed closer. Their siege engines appeared on the horizon, wooden towers rising like skeletal giants. From the ramparts, Alexandrians watched them inch forward, hauled by oxen and men. They seemed slow, almost clumsy, but everyone knew their patience. A machine did not rush, it ground forward until nothing stood. Antony insisted on sorties to burn these engines before they reached the walls. One such attempt ended in disaster, flaming arrows loosed too soon, the Romans repelling the attackers with disciplined volleys. When survivors staggered back, their wounds raw, Antony slammed his fist against the stone battlement. "Cowards!" he roared, not at his men, but at the very inevitability that Rome represented. Cleopatra, standing near, said nothing. She let him rage, knowing that fury was the only salve left to his pride. At night the palace grew quieter. Torches still burned, but laughter had vanished from its halls. Servants moved softly, their eyes lowered. Musicians plucked half-hearted tunes that fell into silence sooner than they began. Cleopatra, still dressed in gold, still walked with measured grace. But in her solitude she felt the weight of every silence pressing in, the silence of ships at sea, the silence of walls waiting to be tested, the silence of a city holding its breath. One night, as the moon rose pale over the harbour, Cleopatra and Antony again stood together at their terrace. The Roman campfires glowed brighter now, so near they seemed almost to brush against the city's own lights. Antony leaned heavily against the balustrade, his shoulders slumped. Cleopatra placed her hand lightly upon his arm. "Do you still believe we can win?" she asked softly. His eyes did not leave the horizon. "I believe in fighting until the gods themselves say otherwise." Cleopatra exhaled, her gaze steady. "Then we will fight, but we will also endure." For endurance, she knew, was Egypt's truest weapon. Dynasties rose and fell, conquerors came and went, but Egypt, the root, remained. She would ensure it, even if her own chapter ended in darkness. The drums of Rome began their steady beat the next morning. Not hurried, not loud, just steady. A rhythm that promised the storm had finally broken. The dawn was ruddy when the siege truly began. For weeks, the citizens of Alexandria had watched the Roman engines crawl nearer, their frames silhouetted like grim scaffolds against the horizon. Now, as the sun rose, those towers were close enough that their ladders gleamed with dew. To the watchers on the walls, it felt as if the landscape itself had shifted, no longer fields, no longer sea, but a plain of wooden monsters, advancing step by step. The first strike came not with fire, but with sound. Roman rams pounded against the outer gates, with a rhythm that echoed across the city like a monstrous heartbeat. The blows reverberated in the stones, travelled up the walls, and rattled through every alley. Children covered their ears, dogs howled, and the air itself seemed to flinch. The defenders answered with stones hurled from catapults, chunks of masonry cracking down onto Roman shields. Yet the Romans moved with their usual patience, raising their testudo formations, inching forward under the rain. Antony rode the walls that morning, his presence a kind of living standard. He called out encouragements, his voice hoarse but fierce, promising that Alexandria would hold. His armor was dented, his cloak torn, yet his eyes blazed with a soldier's certainty, the certainty that to yield was worse than death. At intervals he dismounted to seize a bow, loosing arrows himself into the mass of advancing Romans. The men cheered him, though their cheers were tinged with desperation. Cleopatra did not ride the walls, but she made her presence felt. She moved through the palace courtyards and outer gardens, where wounded soldiers were carried for treatment. She touched their brows, whispered words of solace, and handed cups of water to men too weak to lift them. The healers worked feverishly, their basins stained with crimson, the smell of blood thick in the air. Still, Cleopatra's composure never cracked. To each soldier, she spoke as if their survival were Egypt's survival, and for a moment, they believed her. Within the city, daily life bent under the weight of war. Bakers kneaded dough in silence, the crack of rams audible even above their ovens. Merchants pulled down their shutters as arrows occasionally whistled over the walls. In the temples, incense smoke coiled ever thicker, priests chanting with urgency as though their gods might be persuaded by volume. Yet, amid it all, the city endured. Alexandria had been built by conquerors and scholars alike, and its people had inherited both stubbornness and pride. The first breach came near the southern quarter, where a section of wall crumbled under relentless battering. Romans surged forward, their standards raised, their chants thunderous. For a moment it seemed the flood would overwhelm, but Antony led a countercharge, his cavalry pouring into the breach, spears flashing, hooves pounding. The clash was brutal, close, the kind of fighting where breath and sweat mingled with blood. Antony himself was seen cutting down a standard-bearer, seizing the Roman eagle and casting it into the dust. The defenders roared with renewed vigor, pushing the Romans back long enough for rubble to be hastily piled. The gap crudely patched, but the victory was fleeting. Everyone knew another blow would come, and another after that. Rome did not stop because of a single setback. Rome ground forward until resistance was crushed. That night, Alexandria smouldered. Fires burned where arrows had struck roofs, smoke drifting into the streets. Families huddled together, listening to the distant clamour. The once bustling harbour now lay eerily still, Roman ships blockading every approach. Fishermen no longer dared slip out. The sea that had once fed the city now trapped it. In the palace, Cleopatra summoned her closest advisers. They spoke of dwindling stores, of wells strained, of of spirits wavering. Some urged her to seek terms before the city was reduced to ashes. Others counselled stubborn defiance, citing omens or the loyalty of the people. Cleopatra listened, silent, her fingers tracing the carved armrest of her throne. When they finished, she spoke only this: Egypt has not endured for millennia by bending at the first storm. Yet in private, she weighed darker options. She thought of her children, of their uncertain fate should Octavian triumph. She thought of the treasures of Alexandria, of the library's scrolls, of the temple's gold. She thought of her own image queen, enchantress, survivor, and how history might choose to remember her. Would she be cast as villainous, temptress, destroyer of Antony? Or would her defiance be remembered as the last flame of a dying age? On the second day of assault, Octavian's siege towers reached the walls. Their ladders unfolded, bridging the gap between earth and battlement. Romans swarmed upward like an unending tide. The defenders fought desperately, hurling oil, stones, and boiling water. Some towers were set aflame, collapsing in showers of sparks. But for each destroyed, another pressed forward. The air filled with the clang of steel on steel, the screams of wounded, the roar of fire. Antony seemed everywhere at once, rallying his men, dragging wounded comrades back to safety, throwing himself into the thick of the fight. His cloak was soon soaked not only with sweat but with blood his own, though he dismissed the wound as nothing. Cleopatra, from a tower window, watched him with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. He was magnificent, she thought, magnificent and doomed. That night, when Antony returned, his body streaked with grime and exhaustion, Cleopatra bathed his wounds herself. He winced, but did not protest. "You fight like Achilles," she murmured, her hands steady as she wrapped linen around his arm. He gave a weary laugh. "Achilles died young." She looked at him then, her eyes unwavering. "So did Alexander. But both live still, in memory. Perhaps that is all that matters." Outside, the Romans' campfires burned brighter, closer. The city seemed to shrink under their glow, every street corner touched by the knowledge that an empire pressed at its gates. And yet, Alexandria did not yield. Its walls still stood, its people still clung to defiance. For Cleopatra, every hour that the city endured was both a triumph and a torment. She knew time was not on her side. Rome had endless supplies, endless men. Alexandria had only what it could muster from within. Yet she also knew that survival was not always measured in victories. Sometimes it was measured in the stubbornness of holding on, even as the tide rose around you. As dawn broke on the third day, the drums began again. Slow, steady, inevitable, Alexandria braced, and the queen at its heart stood straighter, her eyes fixed not on the flames of the siege, but on the idea of endurance beyond them. By the fourth day of open assault, Alexandria was no longer the radiant jewel it had once been. The marble streets were littered with debris, broken arrows, splintered shields, and the shattered remains of Roman siege ladders. Smoke drifted constantly across the skyline, blurring the sharp outlines of temples and palaces. The scent of burning oil clung to everything, mingled with the sourness of unwashed bodies and the copper tang of blood. Inside the city, hunger crept in like a silent enemy. Bread grew scarce. What loaves remained were coarse, baked with whatever flour could be found, even ground acorns or weeds. Water, once drawn freely from the Nile-fed canals, became rationed. Soldiers received priority, while ordinary citizens carried empty jars from dry fountains, waiting in vain. The once bustling market stalls now stood stripped bare, their awnings sagging, merchants gone to the walls or cowering in their homes. Cleopatra walked those streets herself, veiled and accompanied by only a handful of attendants. She wanted to be seen. She paused to place a hand on a woman's shoulder, to lift a child into her arms, to whisper reassurance that the city still stood. that Egypt's spirit had not broken. To the weary, those brief encounters mattered. Yet she too could see the shadows in their eyes. The knowledge that Rome pressed closer each night, that survival felt less like destiny and more like a coin spinning in the air. Antony, meanwhile, was wearing down. His wounds, though hastily bound, festered in the summer heat. He slept little, ate less, and rode ceaselessly from wall to wall. His soldiers adored him for it, but even they could see the toll. His once massive frame seemed to shrink. His eyes, once fiery, grew bloodshot and hollow. Yet if anyone spoke of it, he waved them off with a barked laugh, claiming he had no need for rest while Alexandria still breathed. Octavian's tactics tightened like a noose. He did not fling his entire force against the walls again. Instead, he pressed the blockade, starving the city, while sending probing attacks at irregular intervals. Siege engines pounded at different sectors by turns, denying defenders any rhythm of relief. The strategy was not dramatic, but it was effective. Where Antony sought heroic stands, Octavian sought inevitability. At night, Cleopatra and Antony met in the palace, their conversations shifting between strategy and sorrow. Scrolls lay unrolled across tables, maps dotted with markers. Messengers came and went, reporting on breaches patched, on supplies hidden or spent. But in the pauses, the silences between words, another truth lingered, that their world was shrinking. One night, as torches flickered low, Cleopatra spoke with unusual bluntness. "We must think of the children." Her voice was low but firm, her eyes glinting in the lamplight. "If Rome takes the city, their fate will be worse than ours. Sons of Antony, sons of Cleopatra, they will be paraded in chains." Antony leaned heavily against the table, his hand trembling as it traced the edge of the map. "Do you think Octavian will show mercy?" His voice was ragged, tinged with both bitterness and despair. "He shows none to men. Perhaps to children?" Cleopatra did not answer immediately. Instead, she poured him wine, watching as he drank it down in one long swallow. "Mercy is a tool to him, nothing more. He will grant it if it serves his image, deny it if it strengthens his power. We cannot depend on it." The silence stretched, filled only by the muffled thud of distant rams against the wall. Then Antony spoke again, softer now. "When Caesar died, I thought the gods had ended an age, but now I see they meant for him to be replaced. Octavian is not Caesar's equal, but he is his heir, and that is enough. He will not rest until every rival is dust." Cleopatra reached out then, laying her hand over his. "Then we must decide how to shape the dust we leave behind." Outside, the people of Alexandria adapted to their siege with grim creativity. Families boiled leather scraps for broth. Cats and dogs vanished from the streets, victims of hunger. In some districts, desperate men broke into grain storehouses, only to be cut down by soldiers guarding the rations. The city's laughter was gone. Its nights, once alive with music and lamps along the Canopic Way, now lay dark and heavy, punctured only by the groan of siege machines. The defenders on the walls grew gaunt. Their armor hung looser on their frames. Their hands shook as they lifted spears. Yet still they fought, as much for pride as survival. Each repelled ladder, each toppled tower, was cheered with hoarse voices. They fought not only for Cleopatra and Antony, but for Alexandria itself, for the idea that their city, founded by Alexander, beacon of knowledge and wonder, might yet defy even Rome. On the 7th day of open assault, Octavian shifted tactics again. Fire ships were sent against the harbour defences, their sails drenched in pitch, set ablaze, and driven by the wind into Alexandria's docks. Flames leapt skyward, engulfing wooden piers, warehouses, and ships alike. The harbour, once lifeblood of the city, became a furnace. Smoke rolled inland, choking the defenders. The people watched in horror as their fleet, already crippled, was consumed in a single night of fire. For Cleopatra, the sight was a knife to the heart. She had dreamed once of ruling the eastern Mediterranean with Antony, of ships flying her standard from Syria to Crete. Now the dream burned before her eyes. Yet she did not collapse. Instead, she stood on a palace balcony, her children at her side, and watched the inferno without flinching. To those who saw her, the message was clear. Their queen would not weep while Alexandria still lived. But in private chambers, she began to plan what could not be said aloud. Hidden vaults were stocked with poisons, the kind that left no pain, no lingering. Trusted attendants were instructed quietly in what to do if the palace fell. Cleopatra had no intention of being paraded through Rome in golden chains, a trophy for Octavian's triumph. If Alexandria was to be conquered, she would decide her own fate, and perhaps that of Antony too. Meanwhile, whispers spread in the city. Some said Cleopatra prepared secret tunnels for escape. Others claimed she stored away treasure to buy Octavian's mercy. Still others believed she consulted astrologers, seeking a sign that Egypt's gods would yet intervene. The truth, as always, lay between rumor and resolve. Cleopatra sought not escape but dignity. Each morning brought the same drumbeat. The rams, the ladders, the fire. Each evening brought the same weariness, the same whispered prayers. Alexandria had not yet fallen, but the horizon grew narrower, the options fewer, and in those narrowing walls, Cleopatra sharpened her final resolve. If Rome would write the end of Egypt's last queen, she would make sure it was a chapter they would never forget. The 9th day of continuous assault dawned under a sky that seemed bruised, streaked with smoke and ash. Alexandria's famed sunlit clarity had dimmed into a permanent twilight, as though even Ra himself had turned his face away. On the eastern wall, soldiers coughed into cloths wrapped around their mouths, their voices hoarse from shouting and smoke. Mark Antony was there again, his armor dulled and dented, his hair tangled with sweat and grime. He still carried himself with the bearing of a general, but those closest to him saw the tremors in his hands, the heaviness in his stride. The iron resilience that had once carried him through campaigns across Gaul and Parthia was thinning like worn parchment. That morning, he attempted one of his trademark speeches, rousing, defiant, brimming with bravado, but the words faltered. His soldiers cheered dutifully, yet they exchanged sidelong glances, for they could hear the weariness lacing his tone. The lion was roaring still, but the echo rang hollow. When a section of the wall collapsed under repeated battering, Antony seized a spear and led the countercharge himself. The defenders surged with him, hurling stones, jabbing pikes, pouring oil on the ladders. For a brief moment, Rome was repelled again, but when the fighting subsided, Antony collapsed against the wall, blood trickling from a reopened wound. His aides half carried him back to the palace, where Cleopatra waited. She saw him stagger through the doorway, and her face remained composed, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the armrest of her chair. He sank onto a couch, and attendants swarmed to tend him, cutting away torn armor, washing the wounds. Cleopatra dismissed them all with a wave. Alone, she knelt beside him, pressing her palm to his fevered brow. "Enough," she whispered. "You cannot fight the wall for them. You are their general, not their shield." Antony gave a bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "What am I, if not both? If I cannot fight, then I am already defeated." Her eyes held his, unblinking. "If you fight until you are broken, Alexandria is lost. If you live, there is still choice, still dignity, still a queen who loves you." The words pierced through him, for Antony had always been a man torn between love and duty, honor and indulgence. Now those contradictions pressed hardest of all. He closed his eyes, as if seeking escape from her gaze. Meanwhile, Cleopatra convened her most trusted advisors in secret. In a chamber beneath the palace, lit by oil lamps, she sat among scrolls and sealed jars. The high priest of Isis spoke first, urging her to call upon Egypt's gods to make offerings that might turn fate. A Greek scholar argued instead for diplomacy, sending envoys to Octavian with promises of tribute, perhaps even of Cleopatra's throne, in exchange for her children's lives. Others urged desperate measures, breakout attempts, assassinations, or a scorched earth defense of the palace itself. Cleopatra listened in silence. Her mind weighed not just strategies but symbols. She knew that Alexandria's fate was already sealed. Rome would not be denied. What remained was how she, Cleopatra, daughter of the Ptolemies, would be remembered. That evening, she descended alone to the palace vaults. Chests of gold and jewels lay stacked in the torchlight, treasures gathered across generations. To most rulers, these would have been the final card to play tribute to buy mercy. Cleopatra walked among them like a woman surveying a tomb. She knew Octavian would take them regardless. But she also knew the greater treasure was not gold, it was the story. How Egypt's queen met her end would outshine any jewel in history's memory. Above her, in the city, despair thickened. Mothers soothed crying children with lullabies, even as their own bellies ached from hunger. Merchants who had once haggled over spices now bartered scraps of wood for fuel. Priests led processions through the streets, carrying icons of Isis, Osiris, and Horus, begging the gods to spare the city. Yet the prayers too sounded weary, unanswered. Octavian, for his part, remained cold and deliberate. From his camp outside the walls, he directed the siege with calculated patience. Reports reached him daily. Alexandria was starving. Antony was weakening. Cleopatra was seen less in public. He needed only to tighten the grip and wait for the breaking point. In his private letters to Rome, he already hinted at triumph, promising the Senate that Egypt would soon be theirs. Inside the palace, Cleopatra and Antony shared long silences. Sometimes they spoke of tactics, but more often now they spoke of the past of the Nile barge where they first met, of banquets filled with laughter, of children's laughter echoing in the halls. At times, Antony wept openly, ashamed not of tears but of failure. Cleopatra did not weep. She sat upright, regal even in exhaustion, her presence a shield against despair. One night, a trusted attendant brought her word that Octavian's envoys sought parley. The suggestion was clear. Surrender terms might yet be possible. Antony bristled at the idea, calling it dishonor. Cleopatra, however, did not dismiss it outright. Terms, she murmured, are another way of measuring power. If Octavian sends envoys, it is because he wants something, not just the city. Perhaps he wants me alive. Perhaps he wants me broken. She resolved to meet the envoys, not in secret but in the full light of her throne room, draped in gold-threaded linen, crowned with the diadem of the Ptolemies. She received them as though Egypt were untouched, as though famine and siege were mere illusions. The Roman envoys bowed stiffly, but their eyes betrayed awe. Even in the twilight of her reign, Cleopatra radiated majesty. Their message was simple. Octavian demanded unconditional surrender. Antony's life would not be spared. The children's fate was uncertain. Cleopatra's, they implied, might be negotiable, but only if she came to Rome willingly. She dismissed them with polite words, her face unreadable. Only when they were gone did she turn to her attendants and whisper, "So this is his mercy. A gilded chain, a Roman stage. He would have me live, not as queen, but as spectacle." Her resolve hardened further. She would never allow Rome to display her in triumph. Already, she began rehearsing in her mind the last chapter of her life, how it might be written not by Octavian's scribes, but by her own hand. And so, As the 21st day of siege loomed, Alexandria still stood, but only barely. Its walls cracked, its granaries hollow, its harbour ashes. Within, two figures remained at the city's heart. One fading soldier, one unyielding queen, each grappling not with whether the end would come, but with how they would meet it. The 22nd day of the siege began with silence. No battering rams, no horns, no Roman shouts, only the groan of the city's timbers settling under strain. Alexandria's defenders took the quiet as ominous, and indeed it was. Octavian's strategy had shifted. He no longer needed to hammer the walls when hunger and despair were already tearing them down from within. Antony sensed it too. He paced the palace corridors like a caged animal, armor hanging loosely on his frame, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. His mind, once sharp in battle, now chased ghosts of strategy that dissolved under scrutiny. At times, he would order sorties, only to cancel them moments later. Soldiers who once revered him whispered that the great general had lost his edge. Cleopatra watched, her face unreadable, though inside her heart churned. She knew the breaking point was near, not the city's, not hers, but Antony's. He, who had always thrived on glory and spectacle, could not abide the slow suffocation of siege. His spirit, like his body, rebelled against decay. That night, he called for wine, far more than his wounds or his strength could bear. Reclining on a couch, he drank deeply, his laughter too loud, his stories of past triumphs too wild. Cleopatra sat beside him, her hands folded, her eyes calm pools. She had seen this before, the bravado of a man hiding from the abyss. At one point, he seized her wrist and pulled her close. "Cleopatra," he slurred. "They say Octavian is merciful to the conquered. Perhaps we go to him. Perhaps he will grant you life at least. You could—" She silenced him with a finger to his lips. "Do not speak of life on his terms. I would rather drink poison than march in his parade." Antony's eyes brimmed with sudden tears. "Then what am I? A fool who dragged you to ruin, a shadow of a man who once shook the world." She leaned close, her voice low and steady. "You are still Mark Antony, beloved of Rome and Egypt, but Rome has turned its back. Only Egypt remains. Only us." He clung to her hand like a drowning man. For a moment, silence stretched, broken only by the muffled cries of children outside, hungry, sleepless. Antony's jaw tightened. He could not bear the thought that his fight, his love, had led to this. The next dawn, a rumor spread through the palace. Cleopatra was dead. The news fell like a hammer. Attendants whispered, soldiers muttered, and Antony froze as though struck by lightning. A messenger arrived, trembling, claiming that the queen had taken her own life rather than fall into Octavian's hands. Antony's world cracked. He staggered back against the wall, his face ashen. For hours, he sat in silence, staring into nothing. At last, he whispered, "Then what remains for me?" He summoned his sword-bearer, Eros, the same loyal companion who had followed him through countless campaigns. "Do it," Antony ordered, voice hoarse. "Strike, as I have commanded you before." Eros looked at him with tears. "My general, forgive me." With that, he turned the blade upon himself, falling dead at Antony's feet. Antony let out a cry that shook the chamber. "Even you, faithful Eros, you could not do it for me." He lifted the sword himself, hands trembling, tears blurring his sight. He pressed the blade to his chest and drove it home. The wound was deep, but not mortal. He collapsed onto the floor, blood seeping into the tiles, pain wrecking his body. He writhed, calling out not for Rome, not for glory, but for Cleopatra. and then a voice. A hurried attendant, pale and sweating, burst into the room. "My lord, the Queen lives. She lives still." Antony gasped, confusion overtaking agony. "Lives? No. I heard. It was false, my lord. A ruse. She lives, in the mausoleum. She has barred herself inside with her treasure, and she calls for you." In that moment, Antony's will sparked again. Summoning the last of his strength, he demanded to be carried to her. His soldiers lifted him on a litter, his blood staining their arms, his breath ragged. Step by agonizing step, they bore him through the palace, down corridors where statues of Isis and Horus seemed to watch with mournful eyes, out into the streets where citizens recoiled at the sight of their broken general. At last, they reached the mausoleum, the stone chamber Cleopatra had sealed as both sanctuary and tomb. The doors were barred from within, but ropes were lowered from the window above. Antony, pale as marble, insisted on being lifted up. His men tied him with cords, and slowly, painfully, they raised him toward the Queen. Inside, Cleopatra stood waiting. Her eyes widened as Antony was hauled through the opening, his body slick with blood, his face grey with death's shadow. She rushed forward, cradling him as he collapsed into her arms. "My love," he whispered, voice barely audible. "I thought you gone, and so I tried to follow." Tears finally welled in Cleopatra's eyes, but she did not let them fall. She held his face, kissed his brow, and murmured, "Do not leave me yet, not while breath remains." But even as she spoke, she felt the weight of him grow heavier. His breaths came in gasps, shallow and fading. Antony's eyes, once fierce and unyielding, softened as they gazed into hers. "Remember me," he breathed, "not as I am, but as I was, in Tarsus, on the Nile, when the world was ours." She held him closer, whispering his name again and again, as though the repetition might anchor him to life. But the tide was inexorable. With one last exhale, Mark Antony's spirit slipped away, leaving Cleopatra in silence. The Queen who had faced Caesar, who had defied Octavian, who had ruled Egypt with wit and will, now sat in the dim mausoleum, cradling the body of the man who had been her partner in both passion and ruin. Outside, Alexandria still burned. Inside, Cleopatra's resolve hardened into iron. She had not wept in public for years, but now her tears fell freely, streaking her face, soaking Antony's chest. Yet even in grief, her mind sharpened. Antony was gone. Octavian would come, and the world would soon demand an ending worthy of legend. The mausoleum was heavy with silence. The last echoes of Antony's death rattle had faded, leaving Cleopatra alone with the stillness of stone and the weight of his body in her arms. She had watched kingdoms rise, had ruled through famine and flood, had charmed Julius Caesar and bound Mark Antony's heart. Yet at that moment, she felt only the cold press of inevitability. Octavian would come. He always came, not with passion, not with fire, but with patience and calculation. His victory was already written not in the clash of swords, but in the slow choking of Egypt. He was Rome's new Caesar, and he would not leave Alexandria until its queen was broken. Cleopatra rose, gently laying Antony's body upon the couch. She arranged his limbs as though he were still a general, as though death had not diminished his dignity. Then she turned to her attendants, Irus and Charmion, who had stood weeping in the shadows. "Fetch water," Cleopatra ordered softly. "Wash him. Wrap him in linen as befitting one who stood with Caesar and conquered half the world. He will not go to the gods as a beggar." They obeyed through their tears. Cleopatra herself lit incense, its smoke curling like whispers toward the ceiling, filling the chamber with the scent of myrrh and cedar. She placed a laurel wreath upon Antony's brow, a relic from their triumphs in Alexandria, and stood for a long while in silence, her hand upon his chest. At last she whispered, "You are gone, but I remain, and that is the cruelest fate of all." Outside, the city groaned under Octavian's encroaching forces. Messengers came with reports, more districts taken, soldiers demanding surrender. Cleopatra listened without outward emotion, though each word drove a deeper thorn into her composure. When the messenger finished, she asked a single question. "Has Octavian demanded me alive?" The man hesitated, then bowed. "Yes, my queen. He insists you be taken living. He wishes to display you in Rome." A thin smile crossed Cleopatra's lips, not of joy, but of grim recognition. So, he would chain Egypt's queen to his triumphal chariot, as once they chained the kings of Gaul and Numidia. Her attendants gasped, horrified. "No, my queen, he cannot." But Cleopatra raised her hand. "He can. He will. That is Rome's way, to grind greatness into spectacle." That night, she paced the mausoleum with restless energy, her mind turning over possibilities like dice in a gambler's hand. Escape was impossible. Octavian's nets stretched too wide. Bargaining was useless. He wanted her alive, not free. Survival meant humiliation, and humiliation was worse than death. So she began to consider the means of her own end. First, she called for poisons. Vials were brought, mixtures of henbane, hemlock, aconite. She tested a few drops on condemned prisoners. Some writhed for hours before death came. Others slipped into stupor, mouths foaming, limbs jerking. None died with dignity. Cleopatra frowned. Too slow. Too ugly. Egypt's queen will not convulse before Roman eyes. Then she turned her mind to serpents. Egypt's lands teemed with them, the cobra, the asp, the horned viper. Some kills were swift, others cruel. She summoned a basket of snakes from the palace handlers and observed their bites upon sacrificial animals. The asp's venom seemed quickest, paling the flesh within minutes, bringing stillness like sleep. She nodded slightly. Perhaps the gods whisper in this, for was not the asp sacred to Isis? If Egypt's last queen must go, let it be in the embrace of her own land. Charmian, pale, dared to speak. "But mistress, there is still hope. Octavian may spare you." "Spare me?" Cleopatra's voice cracked like a whip. "He would spare my life, yes. To parade me through Rome, bound in chains, mocked by crowds, jeered by senators who once bowed to me. That is not life, Charmian. That is burial in shame." Her words hung heavy in the chamber. The attendants fell silent. Cleopatra then ordered a secret audience with Proculeius, Octavian's envoy. She received him not as a supplicant, but as a queen still enthroned, her jewels glittering, her back straight. "Tell your master," she said coldly, "that Cleopatra of Egypt still breathes. But if he would claim me alive, he must come swiftly, for I am not inclined to wait long upon his pleasure." Proculeius bowed low, concealing his triumph. Octavian's plan was working. She still clung to the rituals of power, even as her world crumbled. When he left, Cleopatra turned to Iris and Charmian. "It is nearly done. Make ready the garlands, the ointments, the crown. When the end comes, it will not find me in rags. I will meet it as queen, not captive." As the hours wore on, she grew strangely calm. Grief had passed through her like a storm, leaving behind a stillness sharp as glass. She spoke little, save to issue quiet instructions. Antony's body was to be entombed beside hers. The treasures of the mausoleum were to remain sealed a monument to what had been Egypt's last glory. In private, she took her children into her arms, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus. She kissed their brows, whispered prayers into their ears, and gave them into the care of their tutors. Octavian would spare them, she believed, for children were trophies, not threats. But the ache of parting nearly undid her resolve. Only when they were gone from her sight did she allow herself to sink onto her couch, trembling, whispering Antony's name like a charm against despair. The next dawn broke pale and grey over Alexandria. Octavian's legions marched ever closer to the palace, their standards glittering with the eagle of Rome. Within the mausoleum, Cleopatra dressed herself in her royal robes, white linen, a golden diadem, the serpent of Egypt coiled upon her brow. She anointed her skin with oils, perfumed her hair with lotus, painted her lips with crimson. To the world, she would appear as she always had, a queen whose beauty carried the weight of empires. Then, in a low voice, she said to her women, "When the moment comes, I will not falter. You will not falter either. We leave this world together, and in leaving, we deny Octavian his triumph." Charmian's lips trembled, but she nodded. Eros bowed, her face wet with tears. Cleopatra smiled faintly, though her eyes burned with unshed grief. So it is decided. Egypt's last queen will not crawl through Roman streets. She will walk instead into eternity. The streets of Alexandria trembled beneath the boots of Roman soldiers. Octavian entered, not with fire and plunder, but with chilling discipline. His legions marched in formation, their silence more ominous than the wild cries of conquest. For all their restraint, the message was unmistakable. Egypt was no longer its own. The citizens of Alexandria peered from shuttered windows, uncertain whether to weep for their fallen queen or to breathe relief that the chaos of battle had ended. The great city jewel of the Mediterranean, repository of the world's knowledge, had bent its knee to Rome. At the palace gates, Octavian dismounted. He was not a man of theatrics. He wore no wreath, no gaudy armor. His toga was plain white, his laurel crown simple. He moved with the composure of inevitability, like a man collecting what was already his. "Where is the queen?" he asked his officers. Proculius stepped forward. "She has taken refuge in her mausoleum, Caesar. The doors are barred. She refuses entry." Octavian's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, though no warmth touched his eyes. "She thinks the dead can shield her. She will soon learn otherwise." "Oh." He approached the mausoleum, calling up in a measured voice, "Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, the war is over. Mark Antony is gone. Your city has yielded. Come forth, and you shall have life. Resist me, and I shall see you dragged forth regardless." From within, Cleopatra's voice rang clear, steady, tinged with defiance. "You may take Alexandria, Roman. You may claim its treasures, its temples, its libraries, but you shall not take Egypt's queen alive to be mocked by your rabble." Octavian's expression did not flicker. He turned to Proculius. "See that she is brought out unharmed. I require her living." Proculius nodded and devised a ruse. He approached the mausoleum with gestures of conciliation, assuring Cleopatra that he wished only to negotiate her surrender. While her attention was held, his men scaled the walls and slipped through an upper window. Within moments, the doors were unbarred, and Roman soldiers rushed in. Cleopatra drew herself up as they entered, regal even in entrapment. She did not cry out or beg. She merely whispered to her attendants, "So, the fox has outplayed the lioness." The Romans seized her arms, but Octavian ordered them to release her at once. When he stepped inside, she was already seated upon her throne, head held high, golden diadem catching the light of oil lamps. "Caesar," she said, using the title deliberately, "so at last you stand in Alexandria as once Julius stood. Tell me, Do you come as conqueror or as guest? Octavian regarded her coolly. I come as Rome. You will be spared if you yield. Egypt's throne is no longer yours. You will live, but in Rome, under my watch. Cleopatra's lips curved into a faint smile. To live in Rome is not to live. It is to be displayed a jewel in your triumph, a prize for your Senate's applause. I have seen those parades, Octavian. I know how Rome drags kings in chains, their dignity stripped, their children jeered. Do you think I would suffer such a fate? Octavian's eyes narrowed. You will do as Rome requires. Your children's lives depend on it. A flicker of pain crossed Cleopatra's face, but her voice remained calm. Ah, so there lies the truth. You would keep me breathing, not for mercy, but for spectacle. And you would keep my children as hostages. She rose slowly, her presence filling the chamber like a flame that refused to be snuffed. Know this, Roman. I will never walk in chains. Egypt's queen bows only to the gods. Octavian studied her for a long moment. He was not unused to defiance, but in Cleopatra, he recognized something different, a spirit too proud to be bent, too aware of her own legend. He saw also the danger. Her death, on her terms, could rob him of his prize. See that she is watched, he commanded curtly, turning on his heel. Let no one enter, without my word. She is not to die, not yet. The soldiers saluted, but Cleopatra smiled faintly, as though she had already won a small victory. For in his words, she heard confirmation. He feared her escape into death more than her submission in life, and that gave her the resolve she needed. That night, she summoned Iris and Charmian once more. The two women brought wine, fruit, and a small covered basket. Within it, concealed among figs, lay the asp. Cleopatra gazed upon it with strange reverence, as though the serpent were both executioner and liberator. Isis sends her messenger, she whispered. The serpent of Egypt will deliver me where no Roman may follow. Iris trembled. Mistress, must it be so? Perhaps Octavian. But Cleopatra cut her off gently. Number Octavian would keep me alive, yes, but not as queen. He would hollow me out, parade me like a relic, a corpse that still breathes. Better to die as Egypt's sovereign than to live as Rome's trophy. Charmian bowed her head, tears spilling silently. Cleopatra dismissed them for a time, then sat alone, writing a final letter to Octavian. Her script was elegant, unhurried, as though she were composing a love poem rather than arranging her death. To Octavian, ruler of Rome, she wrote, Know that Cleopatra, last queen of Egypt, chooses her own fate. You shall not have me in chains. You shall not display me to your Senate. I have joined Antony, and together we walk where your legions cannot march. My children I entrust to your honor. May you treat them not as foes but as innocents. Farewell. She sealed the letter with her signet and handed it to a guard. Give this to your master, she instructed. Tell him it is the queen's final gift. When the guard had gone, Cleopatra turned to her attendants. It is time. They prepared her chamber with flowers, incense, and silks. Cleopatra dressed once more in her royal robes, the golden diadem upon her brow, her body anointed with oils. She reclined upon her couch, holding the basket close. The serpent stirred, its scales glistening in the lamplight. Cleopatra extended her arm without fear, whispering, Come, child of Isis, do your duty. As the asp struck, its fangs sinking into her flesh, she felt a sudden burning sting, then a strange warmth spreading through her veins. She did not cry out. She merely closed her eyes and sighed, as though settling into sleep. Iris and Charmian, steadfast to the last, followed her example, sharing her fate. They too took the asp's bite, choosing loyalty in death over life in humiliation. When Octavian's men finally forced entry, they found Cleopatra already gone, her beauty undimmed, her face serene in death. At her side lay Eros and Charmion, faithful to the final breath. Charmion, still barely alive, managed to whisper when questioned by a soldier, "It is well done, a queen worthy of her line." Then she too was still. Octavian stood over the scene in silence. His prize had slipped from his grasp, his triumph incomplete. Yet he could not help but feel a grudging respect. Cleopatra had denied him his spectacle, choosing instead to script her own ending, one that would echo through history. The morning after Cleopatra's death, the air in Alexandria was heavy, as though the city itself mourned. The streets were hushed, the markets muted. Word travelled swiftly, not from proclamations, but whispered from lips to ears. The queen is dead. Octavian received her final letter with unreadable calm. He did not rage, nor tear it apart, nor curse her name. He merely read it once, then set it down. "So," he murmured, "she wins even in death." For though he had conquered Egypt, he had not conquered Cleopatra's spirit. She had chosen her own end, robbing him of the spectacle Rome most desired. Still, Rome had its victory, Egypt's crown, its treasury, its fertile land, all now belonged to Octavian. The Ptolemaic dynasty was no more. Yet even Octavian, cold strategist that he was, recognized the weight of what had been lost. Cleopatra's death marked not merely the end of a war, but the end of an age. He ordered that Cleopatra be buried beside Antony, honoring her final wish. Perhaps it was pragmatism, perhaps respect, or perhaps a recognition that their story, entwined in life, could not be separated in death. The mausoleum became their shared tomb, a symbol of passion, ambition, and downfall alike. The Roman soldiers, hardened men, watched the funerary rites with an odd stillness. Here lay Antony, once Rome's brightest general, undone by love and pride. Here lay Cleopatra, last of the pharaohs, undone by the same. Together they had defied Rome, and together they had fallen. In the palace, their children waited, too young to grasp the full measure of what had happened. Caesarion, Cleopatra's eldest son, the boy who bore Julius Caesar's blood, was quietly executed on Octavian's orders. "Too many Caesars is not good," he is said to have remarked with chilling simplicity. The younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared. They were taken to Rome, paraded in Octavian's triumph, though not in chains. Later, they would be raised by Octavia, sister to Octavian and once Antony's wife. History remembers especially Cleopatra Selene, who would grow into a queen in her own right, ruling Mauritania and carrying fragments of Egypt's legacy into another land. But Egypt itself, once a kingdom of gods and monuments, was now a Roman province. The grain of the Nile would feed Rome's people. The wealth of Alexandria would swell Rome's coffers. The queen's palace became the governor's residence. The ancient line of pharaohs, stretching back millennia, ended with Cleopatra's final breath. And yet Cleopatra did not vanish. Her memory, her legend, endured. Poets in Rome whispered of her beauty, her cunning, her tragic love. Some cast her as a temptress who lured great men to ruin, others as a queen of rare brilliance who dared to stand against the might of empire. Octavian himself, later Augustus, could never entirely erase her. In denying him her life, she ensured her story would forever be her own. She became a myth not of Rome's making, but of her own, choosing the woman who chose death over chains, love over submission, dignity over survival. The centuries would carry her name far beyond Alexandria's fallen walls. Artists would paint her in silks and jewels, poets would mourn her fate, playwrights would immortalize her alongside Antony as tragic lovers who defied the world. Her death by serpent's bite whether true or embroidered by rumor, became one of history's most enduring images, a mingling of danger, beauty, and inevitability. And so, Cleopatra's story lingers, not only as Egypt's last queen, nor merely as Rome's adversary, but as something larger, a reminder that even in defeat, there is power in choosing one's end. The Nile still flowed, indifferent to empire. The Library of Alexandria still stood wounded by time, but holding wisdom beyond measure. The pyramids, silent sentinels of Egypt's ancient glory, watched as one age passed into another, and in the quiet of her tomb, Cleopatra lay beside Antony, united in death, bound not just by passion, but by legend. Their love, their downfall, their defiance, all would be remembered not as footnotes of conquest, but as a story to be retold through generations. Perhaps that is why her memory persists, because it is not merely the tale of politics or war, but of human longing, human pride, and human choice. Cleopatra was queen, lover, mother, strategist, and dreamer, but above all, she was never Rome's captive. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, the eternal queen. And now, dear listener, let the tale drift away, like the Nile's waters slipping quietly into the sea. May your thoughts rest easy, carried by history's gentle current, as night deepens and the world grows still. Sleep well, with Cleopatra's story settled in the sands of memory.